Our story begins with a peculiar warning. Every time he drinks, his cultivation level drops. His master's dying wish was for him to quit entirely. Instead, he drank for 81 days straight, discarding his entire cultivation. Naturally, everyone in the sect thought he had finally lost his mind. Even the beautiful elder, who had always seen great potential in him, looked upon him with nothing but utter disappointment. But only he knew the truth. His 9-line immortal system could only be activated by completely emptying his cultivation base. And so, he fell from being a top-tier genius to a lowly sect handyman, spending his days teaching ants how to play the zither. He even taught the guard dog, Da Huang, how to drink and be merry. The outer disciples mocked him daily, but they had no idea what was coming. During these 5 years of system activation, his power had actually skyrocketed. Just as he reached the origin stage, trouble arrived. His junior sister, Lu Ruyan, suddenly appeared, tearfully accusing him of touching her inappropriately while he was resting. We see him lying drunk in the square, while beside him, Ruyan weeps as if her heart is breaking into 1,000 pieces. She begged the elder to grant her justice, claiming her senior brother had just violated her honor in the most shameful way. She claimed he threatened to destroy her cultivation and bury her in a ditch if she ever dared to speak a word of it. With her innocence gone, she wailed she would never be able to find a husband. It was a very convincing performance, to be honest. Ruyan grew more agitated and aggrieved with every word, looking like the very picture of a helpless, pitiful victim. In an instant, her tears ignited the fury of everyone standing around them, turning the entire crowd against him. Elder Huiyun glanced at the tear-streaked face of Ruyan, wondering how such a thing could have happened in their sect. When asked if the accusation was truly a fact, Ruyan immediately dropped to her knees to prove her supposed sincerity. With reddened eyes, she swore that every word was true. Half an hour ago, she claimed, she was simply following orders. She had come to collect the morning dew, only to be pinned to the ground by her senior brother in a drunken, lustful rage. She told the crowd she fought back with all her might, yet he still managed to launch a sneak attack against her. She claimed she only escaped when he momentarily dazed out, and now she begged the elder to restore her stolen justice. Elder Huiyun narrowed his eyes, asking if there was any proof as he scanned the scene. Immediately, Ruyan pulled something from his robes. She produced a red silk undergarment, and the moment the disciples saw it, their faces paled with absolute shock. They couldn't believe her words were actually true, cursing their senior brother for being so heartless. Little did they know, however, that this was entirely a performance directed by Ruyan herself. 2 years ago, a very similar incident had occurred within the sect. That supposedly defiled female disciple had since become the elder's personal apprentice, rising quickly in status. Ruyan wanted to use him as a stepping stone to achieve the same. To make it realistic, she planted the evidence while he was passed out. By stuffing her own garment into his arms and adding her superb acting, she was certain the sect would fall for the trap. Even Elder Huiyun's resolve began to waver at the sight. Meanwhile, Zhao Yuanhao, a longtime admirer of Ruyan, couldn't hold back. He stepped forward like a rabid dog, declaring that such a disgrace to the sect's reputation should have his cultivation base destroyed. He demanded his limbs be severed before being expelled from the Qingxin sect, just as the crowd began to roar in agreement. A lazy, relaxed voice drifted through the air, asking why everyone was gathered. The man who had been sleeping soundly finally sat up. He casually grabbed his wine flask for a few deep gulps, looking around at the angry faces with sleepy, half-closed eyes. He asked what had just happened, prompting Elder Huiyun to demand an explanation with a look of pure hostility. With a face full of feigned surprise, he locked eyes with Ruyan in the crowd, catching the faint glint of cunning deep in her gaze. He slowly stood up and asked her directly. If he had truly violated her, she should explain exactly how it happened. Ruyan's cheeks turned a deep crimson as she began to weave her tale with practiced, convincing detail. She held up the red garment once more, drawing every disciple's gaze. He looked at the item in her hand with a calm indifference. A cold smile touched his lips as he noted that using a single piece of clothing to frame him was a bit of a stretch, really. Ruyan bit her lip, playing the part of the victim perfectly. She asked how a weak woman like her could possibly joke about her own purity. She looked at him tearfully, asking if he felt even a single shred of guilt for what he'd done. Her display of grievance was so convincing that it drew the pity of many disciples. In that moment, everyone was certain he had lost control after drinking. They believed he had disgraced his junior sister, and even Elder Huiyun couldn't help but frown, unsure of who to trust. To be honest, the evidence looked damning. He ignored the crowd entirely, carrying his wine flask as he approached Ruyan. He asked her once more to confirm if he had truly violated her. Just as she was about to speak, he reached out and sent her flying back with a single, sudden strike. The disciples on both sides were stunned into silence. Ruyan, who had been pampered since childhood, couldn't believe he actually dared to hit her. Now, driven by fury, she rushed toward him like a madwoman. He remained expressionless, meeting her with yet another sharp slap to the face. Zhao Yuanhao, seeing his beloved treated this way, could no longer restrain himself. He charged forward recklessly, thrusting his sword directly at the man's face. Suddenly, a brilliant blue light erupted from his body, and a terrifying sword intent surged toward the heavens. Zhao Yuanhao stopped dead in his tracks, looking up in pure terror at the massive sword piercing the clouds. It was impossible, or so he thought. He stammered, asking how a mere chi refiner could possess such overwhelming power. Our protagonist didn't bother to give him an answer. With a simple wave of his right hand, the giant sword in the sky descended rapidly, causing the entire Qingxian sect to tremble to its core. Countless disciples rushed out of their dwellings in a panic, while birds across the mountains fled as if the world were ending. Rian's face turned deathly pale with fear. She told herself this couldn't be happening. His sword intent was simply too exaggerated to be real. Even the surrounding sect disciples were wearing expressions of utter disbelief. In the entire sect, only the sect master was supposed to possess such power. Zhao Yuanhao, now paralyzed with fear, began to beg for his life. It was a pathetic sight, really. He screamed that his master was a sect elder and that he wouldn't be let off if he were killed. He remained completely unmoved by the threats. He pressed his hand downward, and the massive sword falling from the cloud struck. Under that terrifying pressure, Zhao Yuanhao's body began to fail. His form shattered like glass before the eyes of the horrified disciples. Not a single person stepped forward to stop it, not even Elder Huoyun. He gave a faint, cold smile, revealing that he was at the peak of the nascent soul stage. He asked the crowd who would even dare to try and kill him. He wondered aloud who could possibly succeed. As the sword intent dissipated, Zhao Yuanhao died, unable to comprehend how his life had ended so abruptly. Rian was trembling with fear at the thought of being at the mercy of a mere servant disciple. She knew she only had one path left. She had to stick to her story until the end. If she were caught framing him, she would face unimaginable punishment. Just then, a figure stepped out from the void, walking through the air itself. A middle-aged man emerged, and the moment Elder Huoyun saw him, he hurried forward to bow in respect. It was the sect master. The man before them was Dan Yangzi, the leader of the Qingxian sect and a powerhouse of the void stage. He spoke slowly, asking what could possibly have caused such a massive disturbance. Seeing her chance, Ruyan rushed forward, her voice breaking as she sobbed. She begged the sect master to grant her justice. After she finished her tearful explanation, Ding Yangzi frowned slightly. He looked at our protagonist, who was still reeking of wine, with a cold gaze. He asked with total indifference if the accusations were true. He simply raised his flask for another drink and replied that it was all utter nonsense. He dismissed it as completely baseless. Before Rian could say another word, Elder Huoyun quickly interjected, addressing the sect master. He suggested that they should simply search Lin Maheng's soul. If the incident truly happened, the truth would be revealed instantly. Hearing this, Rian's face turned deathly pale. In her panic, she had forgotten that the man standing before her was no longer the person she once knew. She quickly told the sect master that she didn't actually blame her senior brother. She only wanted a fair resolution. And then, she changed her tune. She claimed that she had always harbored deep feelings for him. If he were willing to marry her, she would be happy to keep this matter buried in her heart forever. It was such a passionate and selfless speech that the surrounding disciples were nearly moved to tears. To be honest, it was quite the performance. They had no idea that Rian, who originally wanted to ruin him, had realized that he was now a powerful nascent soul cultivator. She figured that if she could become his cultivation partner, her future resources and status would be guaranteed. A very practical shift in loyalty, wouldn't you say? Deng Yangzi frowned, asking if she was certain she wanted to leave the matter to her senior brother's discretion. Before Rian could even answer, Maheng spoke up with a mocking tone. He asked why they should go through all that trouble when a simple soul search would be much easier. Rian's body stiffened, and her expression became visibly uneasy. If they discovered she was lying, she knew her life would be forfeit. Thinking quickly, she pulled out a small blade and held it to her chest. She cried out that if her senior brother refused to take responsibility, she had no reason to live. She claimed she would rather die than live with the shame, and as we might expect, she was hoping this final act of desperation would save her. Her performance was so convincing that everyone present believed her, wondering why Lin Maheng simply wouldn't admit to his actions. They couldn't understand how he could remain silent like a coward while Lu Ruyan was willing to die for him. Facing the slanderous insults of the sect disciples, our protagonist remained carefree, casually taking 3 long gulps of his wine. He wiped the stray drops from his mouth and asked with a smirk if these low-level trash truly intended to challenge him. Such arrogant words, spoken in the face of the crowd, left everyone pale with shock, while Ding Yangzi's expression darkened with rage. Elder Huoyun pointed directly at Maheng's face and roared, calling him insolent and reminding him that this was the Qingxian sect. He shouted that as long as Maheng remained a disciple, he must submit to the investigation so the sect master could provide justice. He warned him against such arrogance. While a nascent soul is strong, it is still like an ant before a void stage powerhouse. Meanwhile, Rian remained on her knees before the sect master and elders, looking as though she had suffered a great injustice. She begged the elders not to blame her senior brother, claiming he was only saying these things because of the alcohol. She insisted that once he sobered up, he would surely agree to the marriage. Deng Yangzi nodded, impressed by the girl's apparent cleverness. He appreciated her attempt to settle the matter quietly, and with a serious face, he announced his final decision to the sect. He declared that from this day forward, Lin Maheng and Lu Ruyan would be joined as cultivation partners. Finally, Rian's heart stopped racing. She felt a wave of relief, knowing that if the sect master had forcibly searched Maheng's memories, her own execution would have followed. After all, the sect had no mercy for those who framed others. Maheng, however, merely curled his lip into a cold, mocking smile. He took another drink and remarked sarcastically that he never expected the great Qingxian sect's leaders to be so utterly blind. Deng Yangzi turned around, his expression becoming increasingly gloomy and menacing at the insult to his authority. To be honest, he only tolerated Ma Heng because of a promise he had made to a senior sister many years ago. Ma Heng lamented how pathetic it was that these so-called immortals would blindly believe a woman's lies, prompting a furious shout of insolence. Deng Yangzi finally snapped, releasing a violent wave of spiritual energy that surged outward, sending the surrounding disciples scrambling in terror. As the disciples trembled in fear, Deng Yangzi roared that even if the accusations were false, he would still purge the sect of such an insolent member. In a fit of rage, the sect master prepared to strike, but Ma Heng simply took another long swig of wine and let out a defiant laugh. He pulled an immortal sword from his spatial realm and swung it with casual indifference, triggering a massive, deafening explosion of energy. The sound was ear-splitting. Deng Yangzi tried to maintain his composed stance, but he suddenly felt the massive sword before him was a genuine threat. He realized Ma Heng's aura wasn't just at the nascent soul level. It felt more like the deity transformation stage, causing a deep sense of unease. A profound and complex emotion began to take root in Deng Yangzi's heart as he felt the shifting tide of the battle. Deep down, he could feel a growing pressure that defied everything he knew about his disciples' supposed strength. The sect master's internal confidence began to waver, replaced by a cold realization that he had severely underestimated the man before him. His heart raced as he struggled to process the sheer power radiating from Ma Heng's casual strike. Deng Yangzi's expression grew heavy with gravity. Though he kept his hands behind his back, he knew his very life was now in danger. He wondered how a mere deity transformation cultivator could possibly pose such a lethal threat to a powerhouse of the void stage like himself. Suddenly, he realized something was wrong. The giant sword was frantically gathering the spiritual energy of heaven and earth into a single point. Shocked that Ma Heng could command the world's essence, Deng Yangzi immediately summoned his own immortal sword to defend himself. While the sect master's brow furrowed in intense concentration, Ma Heng simply found a comfortable spot to lie down and continue drinking. Deng Yangzi had originally thought his void stage cultivation would allow him to suppress the boy easily, but the reality was quite different. To his growing horror, he found himself being pushed back by the flying sword until a soft, commanding voice echoed from the sky. With that single sound, the overwhelming sword intent filling the area instantly dissipated, and several figures descended from the clouds. Leading the group was a woman who looked like a literal goddess descending to the mortal realm, her presence commanding immediate silence. The elders quickly bowed their heads in respect to their senior, Lung Qianing, who was the esteemed sect master's own senior sister. Lung Qianing gave a slight nod before looking coldly at her junior brother, Deng Yangzi, asking if he had forgotten the instructions she gave him. Deng Yangzi was visibly shaken, his fear so great that he stammered out that he wouldn't dare defy his senior sister's previous instructions. Lung Qianing had once declared that Ma Heng was a favored child of heaven, possessed of a truly great destiny. She believed he would eventually break through all limits and return to the peak, and now, she narrowed her eyes at the scene. She asked him coldly why, if he knew this, he still dared to raise a hand against the boy, leaving Deng Yangzi trembling from head to toe. Lung Qianing noted that she was already well aware of today's events, casting a sharp glance at the pale and trembling Lu Ruyan. Perhaps it takes a woman to truly understand another woman's heart, and Lung Qianing was not easily fooled. From the moment she looked at her, she was certain Ruyan was lying, yet she asked if the girl was truly so sure of her accusations. Ruyan insisted that Ma Heng had betrayed her trust, even offering to swear an oath to the heavenly Tao that if she told a single lie, she would never be able to break through to the great success stage in this lifetime, a bold claim that stunned the other disciples. Even Deng Yangzi nearly cursed it out loud. With her mediocre talent, she'd be lucky to even reach the nascent soul stage, to be honest. Why stop at great success? She might as well have claimed she'd become a golden immortal while she was at it. Lung Qianing then produced a glowing green orb from her spatial realm, known as the Pearl of Truth, which turns red if the holder lies. With this, the truth would be revealed instantly, and we see Ruyan's expression grow increasingly tense as the stakes rise. If she held it, her previous lies would be exposed as a self-inflicted blow, prompting Deng Yangzi to nervously interject. He remarked that while his sister's methods were clever, the Pearl of Truth could be quite damaging to a mere qi-refining disciple. Lung Qianing dismissed the concern and tossed the Pearl of Truth to Ma Heng instead, asking him directly if he had truly harassed Ruyan. Ma Heng looked up at the sound of her voice and gave a faint, calm smile, simply stating that he had done no such thing. The Pearl of Truth remained perfectly still and green, which meant, quite simply, that he was telling the absolute truth. The surrounding disciples fell into a heavy silence as they realized that if Ma Heng's words were true, then they had been deceived. It meant the only one lying to them this entire time was Ruyan, who now stood there with her body trembling and her eyes darting away. Since Ma Heng has done nothing wrong, Lung Qianing turned her gaze toward Ruyan, asking why she still refused to admit her guilt. Her voice carried a chilling edge, causing Ruyan to burst into tears as she claimed to be the granddaughter of Prime Minister Lu of the Yulong Kingdom. She swore upon her grandfather's name that she wasn't lying, begging the ancestor to investigate further, which prompted the Sword Seed Elder to intervene. He reminded her that fellow Taoist Lu Longshan was of great importance to the Qingxin sect, and acting against his granddaughter might cause trouble. It could bring unnecessary problems to the sect, the elder warned with a heavy expression, but Lung Qianing simply asked, and what of it? She declared that as long as Rian was a disciple of the Qingxian sect, she would have to pay the price for her own recklessness. Even if Lu Longshan himself were to come to the Qingxian sect in person, she noted, it would change absolutely nothing. Rian's eyes turned red with desperation as she argued she had done nothing wrong, claiming the path of the sword is simply the strong devouring the weak. She asked what sin there was in wanting to become stronger, arrogantly reminding everyone that her grandfather was a prime minister and dared them to touch her. These words finally allowed the other disciples to see her true colors, and we realized they finally understood exactly what kind of person she was. Seeing that her schemes were completely exposed, Ruyin decided to change her tactics as the situation grew increasingly dire. She turned directly to Ding Yangzi, pleading for the sect leader to help her as he had supposedly promised he would. The spearhead of blame was suddenly pointed at Ding Yangzi, who instantly flew into a rage, shouting at the girl for her insolence. He told her not to spread lies, claiming he too had been deceived by her and that her death would be well-deserved, not waiting for her to speak again. Ding Yangzi's eyes turned cold as he suddenly lunged forward, striking her down with a single palm, while Rian's eyes remained wide with shock. She died on the spot, leaving the crowd pale with fright, before Ding Yangzi slowly walked over to stand before Ma Heng. He announced that from this day forward, Ma Heng would be his personal disciple, and without another word, he grabbed the boy and vanished. Elder Huiyun quickly stepped forward to speak the truth of the matter, his face etched with deep concern for the future. He warned that by killing Lu Longshan's granddaughter, they had invited the wrath of an old man who was not known for his mercy. He would certainly never let this matter rest, but Ding Yangzi merely gave a cold snort and asked, once again, what that mattered to him. He dismissed the threat as a mere spirit transformation cultivator, ordering that Rian's body be sealed in ice immediately. It was to be sent back to the Yulong Kingdom, with disciples sent to inform her family, so they couldn't claim any injustice. He declared the Qingxian sect would not be accused of killing the innocent, then left as we transitioned to a quiet wooden house. Inside, Lung Qianing looked at him with certainty, noting with some surprise how quickly he had reached the spirit transformation stage. However, she warned him to remain cautious and avoid having too much contact with Ding Yangzi for the time being. He gave a simple nod, knowing Lung Qianing understood her junior brother better than anyone, having seen his nature since childhood. Ding Yangzi possessed an extreme ambition, willing to execute anyone who stood in his path, a truly charming personality trait, to be sure. If not for their master's final instructions, it was uncertain who would actually be leading the Qingxian sect today. Ma Heng then mentioned that her daughter red wine was exceptionally sweet, asking if he might have a few more jars of it. Lung Qianing then brought up the upcoming grand competition between various cultivation sects, where many young geniuses would participate. Our sect will send 2 representatives to the stage, she explained, and you are going to be one of them. He couldn't help but point out that after the recent battle, he had already reached the spirit transformation stage himself. He asked if she really expected him to fight those foundation establishment geniuses, wondering if it would seem a bit unfair. Lung Qianing rolled her eyes, explaining that the geniuses of other sects are aged between 18 and 200 years old. She reminded him that not everyone is a freak of nature like him, breaking through to spirit transformation at only 18. He could hardly believe his ears, thinking that 200 years old was an age better suited for a venerable ancestor. Yet, in this world, they were still called geniuses, and since it was his master's task, he resolved to give his all. Meanwhile, we see Ding Yangzi returning to his cave with a gloomy expression, stunned by how much Ma Heng had actually grown. Ding Yangzi had once wanted him as a disciple, only for Ma Heng to lose all his cultivation in a single night back then. Seeing him so powerful now filled Ding Yangzi with a bitter jealousy, regardless of Ma Heng's status as the sect's top genius. Deep down, Ding Yangzi believed anyone threatening his position as sect leader deserved to die, and so he summoned his disciple. He called for his top disciple, Wang Teng, telling him to hold nothing back in the coming days. Don't worry, master, the youth replied. Wang Teng vowed to vent this frustration for his master, promising that once he became the champion of the grand competition, he would find the perfect opportunity to eliminate Ma Heng. Ding Yangzi patted Wang Teng's shoulder, reminding him to keep that goal in mind. He warned that if Ma Heng wasn't dealt with during this tournament, Wang Teng's future status would certainly be under threat. Whether he could ever sit in the sect leader's chair depended entirely on this moment. 3 months passed by in the blink of an eye. The grand competition of the immortal sects was about to begin. Once all the cultivators of the Yulong Kingdom had finally gathered, the Emperor of Yulong, a powerful great completion stage cultivator, formed hand seals and launched several golden marks into the sky. The clouds rolled as a crimson light descended from the heavens, forming a massive barrier over the square. To be honest, it was quite a spectacle. Aside from the Dragon Emperor, Lung Qianing was the strongest present, and together they bowed toward the sky with great respect. They greeted the senior from the upper sect as the mist parted to reveal an old man dressed in magnificent, ornate robes. He appeared out of thin air, and in an instant, waves of surging energy began to ripple out in every direction. The peak experts of the Yulong Kingdom felt their hearts skip a beat. This newcomer was actually a powerhouse of the tribulation stage. The old man nodded with satisfaction, introducing himself as an elder from the upper sect sent to oversee the ceremony. He announced that he was there to observe the grand competition and that the one who took first place would be richly rewarded. The victor would be granted a top-tier magical treasure, a legendary sword of immense power. Furthermore, they would earn the right to cultivate within the upper sect itself. Of course, there were rules for all participants. He reminded the crowd that no contestant could be over 200 years old, a very generous definition of youth, indeed. He then issued a chilling warning to anyone who might consider breaking the rules of the competition. The elder declared he would personally ensure that the offender and their entire sect were wiped out overnight. In an instant, a powerful pressure erupted from the elder, causing even the strongest sect leaders to tremble in his presence. We see Maheng look around at his shivering fellow disciples, only to offer a small smile and take another casual swig of wine. The competition began, and after winning 2 consecutive matches, Wang Tung was just preparing to seize the ultimate glory. Suddenly, a burly man with a lean, powerful build stepped out from the crowd, Niu Ming of the Imperial Power Pavilion. Wang Tung didn't care for small talk. He clenched his fist and attacked, only to realize with shock that something was wrong. He found himself completely unable to break through his opponent's physical defense. The pavilion master watched with a cold, knowing smile. He knew that reaching the early stage of soul transformation didn't guarantee safety, as Niu Ming had trained his body since childhood. His physical toughness was easily on par with a mid-stage soul transformation cultivator. Then, Niu Ming swung his massive hand. The strike was incredibly fast, and Wang Tung was sent flying dozens of meters back by a single, crushing blow. Desperate, Wang Tung controlled his immortal sword to pierce Niu Ming, who let out a roar that shattered the stone tiles beneath him. The resulting spiritual energy formed a massive golden bell that shielded him firmly as the flying sword struck the barrier. Upon contact with the golden bell, the sword instantly shattered into pieces. His spirit damaged, Wang Tung coughed up a mouthful of blood. He looked utterly defeated, yet Niu Ming let out another roar and charged forward. It wasn't hard to see his true intentions. He had moved with killing intent to ensure Wang Tung wouldn't become a future enemy. Just as the fist was about to land, Wang Tung shouted his surrender. In front of the upper sect's messenger, Niu Ming didn't dare strike again and pulled back his fist in frustration. Deng Yangzi never expected that Wang Tung would lose so easily, but then, a sudden thought about Maheng crossed his mind. If even Wang Tung wasn't a match, he assumed Maheng wouldn't fare any better. In fact, if Maheng died at Niu Ming's hands, it would be a rather beautiful outcome. With that thought, a strange and sinister smile curled at the corner of Deng Yangzi's mouth. He turned to Leng Qianing, suggesting that only Maheng could possibly turn the tide of such a dire situation. Leng Qianing was well aware of what Deng Yangzi was plotting, but looking at the current state of the field, she remained silent. We see Maheng step forward, casually lifting his wine gourd for another long drink before suggesting they stop wasting time and all attack at once. As his words fall, the entire arena falls into a stunned silence, everyone staring at him with looks of utter disbelief. Noticing the disdain in the eyes of the other geniuses, Maheng simply smiles and sweeps his hand toward the heavens, unleashing a flash of sword light. The strike cuts through the silent sky like a startled swan, leaving the spectators with their mouths wide open at the sight. Wang Tung, in particular, is filled with a cold sweat as he witnesses a single sword strike seemingly cleave the very sky apart. Even the messenger from the upper sect looks toward the field in genuine shock. He can hardly believe he is looking at a late-stage soul transformation cultivator who is still just an 18-year-old youth. It seemed impossible, yet Maheng stands there, challenging any of the fellow cultivators present to step forward and fight him. The various sect leaders frowned deeply, realizing that such a formidable talent cannot be allowed to survive and grow. They see him as a future threat that must be eliminated, just as the other young geniuses were preparing to leave the stage. Suddenly, these disciples receive secret orders from their masters to kill him, a task that feels very much like a suicide mission. To fight a late-stage soul transformation expert at their level? It was a joke, yet they dared not disobey their master's commands. They reluctantly step forward, only to watch as Maheng raises his gourd once more and drains the remaining wine in one go. The crowd thinks he's lost his mind. He's drinking heavily without even using spiritual energy to clear the alcohol from his system. To the observers, he appears to be a gifted talent who is unfortunately nothing more than a hopeless drunkard. They assume he will never amount to much, but facing their mockery, Maheng simply lets out a hearty, boisterous laugh. He recites a verse about the river of time and the stars, then calmly calls out for his sword to come to him. As his voice fades, the thousands of immortal swords held by the Qingxian sect disciples begin to tremble violently. Then, before the eyes of the bewildered crowd, the swords transform into beams of light and soar into the sky. Seeing the terrifying display, the genius of the Law sect, Qing Wuyan, panics and shouts for everyone to attack immediately. Unfortunately for them, it was already far too late. The sword energy surged so violently that the clouds for thousands of miles simply vanished into nothingness. Before the various sect geniuses could even make a move, the overwhelming pressure forced them to cough up mouthfuls of blood. In a single instant, they felt the agonizing pain of their nascent souls being torn apart, prompting the Lin sect leader to let out a furious roar. He screamed at the youth to stop, but Qing Wuyan could only watch in unwilling despair as his body dissolved into a wisp of green smoke. The crowd gasped in collective horror. After all, Qing Wuyan was the famous poison prince at the peak of the nascent soul stage. Everyone watched in stunned silence, hardly able to believe that such a formidable talent had been snuffed out so easily. To die so pointlessly without even a chance for his soul to escape. It was a sight that left the Lua leader, Li Qingshan, gnashing his teeth in rage. He cursed Ma Heng for daring to kill his sect's greatest hope, vowing to destroy him. But another voice suddenly cut through his fury. He offered a final, chilling piece of advice. If they dared to strike, he wouldn't hesitate to wipe the entire Lia sect from existence. She coldly declared that even if their old hidden ancestor interfered, no one would stop her. A bold claim, to be sure. Li Qingshan clenched his fists, but ultimately, his fear of Leng Qianing's status forced him to swallow his burning resentment. The Dragon Emperor watched with a faint smile, asking Leng Qianing if even she was capable of producing such a terrifying sword intent. Leng Qianing remained silent, knowing deep down she couldn't match it, while the Dragon Emperor simply turned his gaze back toward our protagonist. The upper sect messenger stood up, his powerful voice echoing across the arena as he announced that the great sect competition had officially concluded. The undisputed victor was the Qingxian sect's very own genius, Ma Heng. His prizes were prestigious, an ultimate immortal sword and a high-grade storage ring. He was also granted a rare opportunity to cultivate within the upper sect, but at that moment, Ma Heng seemed to have other priorities. To everyone's surprise, he expressed dissatisfaction with the rewards, asking the elder if they could simply be exchanged for some fine wine. The sudden request left the crowd completely speechless. They honestly wondered if the boy had finally lost his mind. Trading an immortal sword and a top-tier storage ring for alcohol? It was, in their eyes, a truly heartbreaking waste of heavenly treasures. Leng Qianing watched him with a slight frown, asking Ma Heng what on earth he was thinking with such a request. He simply replied that a sword is just a tool regardless of rank, and since he already had storage, he preferred fine wine. The upper sect messenger burst into laughter, declaring that if that was his wish, he would grant him 100 jars of 1,000-year brew. He added 1,000 jars of 500-year sake with a smile, noting that since the boy didn't want the treasures, he wouldn't force them. As the jars of wine were laid out, their rich aroma filled the air, leaving the surrounding crowd feeling quite indignant at the trade. Deep down, Ma Heng knew that since his strength was now exposed, keeping a mid-grade immortal sword would only invite trouble. He realized that leaving the sect with such treasures would lead to a relentless hunt, making the wine a far more practical choice for his cultivation. As the upper sect messenger departed, the massive pressure over the Dragon Kingdom vanished, just as the various sect leaders prepared to leave. Suddenly, Lu Longshan stepped forward with a dark expression, revealing a terrifying artifact known as the 10,000 Soul Banner. The elders of the Qingxian sect grew pale and immediately went on high alert, knowing the horror that the Soul Banner represented. Its appearance usually signaled a living hell, and they wondered if this madman actually intended to slaughter the entire Qingxian sect. At that moment, the Dragon Emperor appeared before the crowd, his presence carrying a chilling mix of warmth and cold indifference. He stood there silently, the atmosphere around him shifting between calm and a growing, underlying threat. The air grew heavy as he waited for the tension to reach its breaking point. Lu Longshan barked that the Qingxian sect must give him an explanation today, or he would fight to the death. He threatened to make them taste the agony of the Soul Banner, prompting Leng Qianing to ask if he was simply seeking a quick death. Though her killing intent made him tremble, Lu Longshan found his courage knowing the Dragon Emperor was standing right behind him. Growing bolder, he demanded to know why Dan Yangzi had dared to kill his granddaughter. Dan Yangzi calmly replied that she had slandered their disciples, and according to sect rules, execution was the only fitting punishment. He maintained he had done nothing wrong, which prompted a vulgar, furious outburst from the grieving old man. The old man roared that his granddaughter was a gifted genius who would never do such a thing, and since they didn't believe him, he demanded to personally question the Qingxian sect's so-called prodigy, Ma Heng. He argued that since Ma Heng started this, the claim of slander rested entirely on the boy's word alone. Lu Longshan turned his furious gaze toward the youth who was busy drinking, snapping that the boy owed him an explanation. He threatened that if Ma Heng didn't speak up, he would personally extract his soul and shatter it into pieces. A cold light flickered in Ma Heng's eyes as he wondered why these old men were so relentless, especially since he wasn't the killer. He felt that targeting him was useless, and as Lu Longshan realized he was being toyed with, his rage only intensified. Addressing the crowd, Lu Longshan declared that this boy had murdered his granddaughter, creating a blood feud that could never be settled. He promised that if he were allowed to kill the boy today, he wouldn't take a single item from the boy's body. However, he warned that if anyone interfered, he would turn against them, at which point the Dragon Emperor suddenly burst into laughter. The Emperor commanded that no one from the Dragon Kingdom should interfere, daring Lu Longshan to see if he actually had the nerve to strike. While Leng Qianing's anger flared, a secret message was simultaneously transmitted directly into Lu Longshan's ear. It was the Dragon Emperor's voice, whispering that this boy's extraordinary talent would eventually become a threat to them all. He insisted that the boy must be eliminated today to prevent endless trouble in the future. With the Emperor's secret blessing, Lu Longshan ignored Leng Qianing and prepared his attack. He activated the 10,000 Soul Banner and lunged toward Ma Heng, just as a familiar voice echoed in the boy's mind. The system informed him that drinking 30 jars of wine had triggered a breakthrough to the early Fanshu stage, and his eyes lit up. With a single, swift strike of his heaven-slaying sword, Lu Longshan's physical body was instantly shattered into pieces. Now reduced to a pale soul, Lu Longshan stared at the sword-wielding Mahung and stammered that there had been a misunderstanding. He retreated in pure terror, his spirit form trembling uncontrollably as he realized just how badly he had miscalculated. With a casual wave of his hand, Mahung watched as Lu Longshan was reduced to nothing but ash and smoke. The Dragon Emperor watched this scene with a look of visible shock, waving his hand as he began to descend the mountain while muttering to himself. He couldn't help but whisper in disbelief about a boy who could cross 2 cultivation levels so easily. It was truly unheard of. He wondered if the boy was perhaps the reincarnation of some great spirit. While back on the square, Lung Qianing stood with her hands behind her back, staring coldly. She turned her gaze toward Dan Yangzi, questioning him sharply and noting that it was a disgrace for a sect leader of the Qingxian sect to behave this way. She hadn't expected him to be so cowardly, and Dan Yangzi, hearing this, could only stammer in fear, not daring to offer a single word in response. Later, inside a quiet wooden hut, we see Lung Qianing looking at Mahung with utter confusion, wondering what kind of cultivation genius he actually was. Mahung, having no better explanation, simply made something up, claiming his talent allowed him to grasp the secrets of power just by fighting strong opponents. He explained that this was how he raised his realm, and while this answer didn't quite satisfy Lung Qianing, she decided not to press him further. Over the next few months, Mahung found himself bored staying at Quiet Peak, so he eventually decided to sneak down to the sect's main square. His sudden appearance caused the disciples who were practicing their swordplay to freeze in surprise before they immediately bowed with deep respect. Even the elders greeted him with cupped fists, as his seniority within the sect was so high that even they had to address him as martial uncle. One of the elders approached him and explained that in just half a month, the great sect assessment would finally begin. He reminded Mahung that as the personal disciple of the ancestor, he was expected to set a proper example for all the younger students. This assessment required disciples to travel down the mountain for training, where they would perform good deeds and eliminate evil wherever they found it. The more demonic beasts they slayed, the higher their ranking would be, though Mahung just rubbed his chin, wondering if he really needed to be tested at all. The elder insisted that since this was a trial specifically for the disciples, everyone had to participate, regardless of their status. He then pulled a jade slip from his pocket and handed it over, explaining that it would record every evil spirit or demon Mahung managed to defeat. Mahung took the jade slip and headed down the mountain with his wine gourd in hand, and as soon as he was gone, a familiar face appeared. Wang Ting walked over from a distance and asked if the item had been delivered, to which the elder respectfully confirmed that it had. Wang Ting narrowed his eyes, confident that now the item was in Mahung's hands, the journey down the mountain would be far from pleasant. A cruel smile played on his lips as he wondered how this so-called chosen one would handle himself when faced with a true dead end. After all, the hatred between demonic beasts and humans is absolute, and soon enough, we see Mahung arriving at the edge of the myriad beast forest. He didn't seem to have a care in the world, as he only needed to release a tiny hint of his aura to keep the local predators at bay. Not a single beast dared to approach him, and before long, he came across 2 men and a woman forming a defensive triangle in a clearing. They were surrounding a tiger spirit, a creature that had already reached the late stages of the core formation realm. The tiger spirit struck first, its sharp claws slicing through the air and sending one of the young men flying back in the very first exchange. The remaining 2 were pale with fright, drawing their immortal swords for a desperate stand, though they were beaten to the ground in just a few rounds. Their senior brother struggled to his feet, a spiritual talisman appearing between his trembling fingertips as a last resort. He claimed it was a treasure of their Yunshan sect that would alert their elders the moment anything happened to them. The tiger spirit let out a dark laugh, mocking the boy for trying to use a simple 1,000-mile tracking talisman to scare him off. He told them that by the time their elders actually arrived, the 3 of them would have already been digested into nothingness. Ignoring the injured man, the beast walked toward the terrified junior sister, but right then, a sudden flash of sword energy tore through the air. The tiger spirit recoiled in shock, roaring out to demand who would dare to launch a sneak attack against a powerful spirit like himself. He demanded a name, claiming he never killed nobodies, which was a bit ironic, considering he was about to eat them anyway. Mahung finally revealed himself with a faint smile, casually plucking a fallen leaf from a nearby tree as he spoke. With a simple flick of his fingers, the leaf transformed into a sharp blade of energy that pierced straight through the tiger spirit's massive body. As the beast crashed to the ground and a golden inner core rose from its remains, the 3 cultivators watched Mahung, hardly daring to breathe. They were stunned that someone could kill a late-stage core formation beast with nothing but a leaf, wondering what kind of master they had just met. The senior brother quickly composed himself and bowed with cupped fists, finally catching his breath after the narrow escape. The 3 of them stood frozen, hardly daring to take a single breath as they processed what had just happened. To kill a late-stage core formation tiger spirit with only a leaf, the senior brother wondered what kind of powerhouse stood before them. He immediately cupped his fists in respect, introducing himself as Zhang Feng of the Yunshan sect, alongside his juniors Li Nan and Lin Xiaoer. Ma Hing told them there was no need to be nervous, casually mentioning that he would be taking the tiger's carcass with him. The three of them wouldn't dream of objecting and nodded repeatedly as we see Ma Hing smiling while he collected his prize. To him, this was a treasure. The meat could be roasted, and the inner core was worth at least dozens of jars of homebrewed wine. He prepared to take his leave, but suddenly Lin Xiaoer called out to him, explaining the true reason they had come here. They were searching for a legendary spirit beast, and she offered to guide him if he would only share a few drops of its blood. Ma Hing gave an indifferent shrug and agreed, and soon they were traveling by a mortal sword, though it wasn't long before he was lying down. To her utter disbelief, he actually fell into a deep, snoring sleep right there on the flying sword. Lin Xiaoer was stunned. They were in the heart of the myriad beast forest, a place where even nascent soul experts could meet their end. And yet, this senior was so unbothered that he drank himself into a slumber, only waking up once night had finally fallen. He looked at the visibly tense Lin Xiaoer and asked if she hadn't bothered to rest, earning himself a very strange look in return. He told her that one should sleep when tired and eat when hungry, as cultivation is far too dull without wine and conversation. Lin Xiaoer found herself looking at the man in a new light. In the world of cultivation, few possessed such a relaxed state of mind. After starting a campfire, Ma Hing skillfully began roasting the choice cuts of the tiger's spirit over the flames. The rich aroma of the meat soon filled the air, and he quite gentlemanly offered a portion to the young woman. She thanked him, but in that moment, Ma Hing sensed something in the darkness and stood up to face the shadows behind them. He told the hidden watchers to come out and stop hiding, and right on cue, the rustling of the undergrowth gave way to a presence. An old man dressed in black robes stepped out, surprised to find anyone so deep within the myriad beast forest. The old man in black robes licked his lips with a lecherous grin, remarking that he had stumbled upon a pair of little thieves. His eyes locked onto Lin Xiaoer as he crudely noted that he was in need of a cultivation vessel, and she would do nicely. He told her she could help cool his inner fire, but as the last of those vile words left his mouth, the atmosphere shifted. A cold flash of light instantly pierced the old man's chest. Ma Hing simply noted that evil cultivators deserved no mercy on their way to the underworld. The old man looked at Ma Hing in sheer terror, immediately abandoning his physical body and attempting to let his nascent soul escape at any cost. Unfortunately for him, he was far too slow in front of Ma Hing, and a moment later, his nascent soul was completely extinguished. Lin Xiaoer stood frozen on the spot, unable to believe that a nascent soul monster had been killed so effortlessly. As she struggled to process the death of such a powerful foe, she looked over to find Ma Hing already back to gulping down his wine. He acted as if nothing had happened at all, a demeanor that was vastly different from the image of a powerful expert she held in her heart. She had always assumed true masters were solemn and serious, yet the man before her was a messy, wine-loving eccentric. The following day, Ma Hing suggested they head out to find her legendary spirit beast, and soon the two arrived at a dense bamboo forest. Lin Xiaoer explained that her master had told her this very forest was the habitat of the creature they were seeking. Ma Hing immediately enveloped the entire forest with his divine sense, noting that he had never encountered a beast of this particular kind before. With a sudden flicker of movement, he appeared behind the creature and grabbed it by the scruff of its neck, wondering if this little thing was the legend in question. It was only at the early core formation stage, which Ma Hing found rather amusing, though the beast began to shout indignantly for him to let go. The creature complained that the filthy human was hurting it, so Ma Hing curiously placed it down on the nearby grass. He wondered what its true form was, seeing as it had reached the core formation stage while still a juvenile, but the beast just bared its teeth. It snapped that it was none of his business and warned the cunning human to leave quickly before its subordinates arrived. It claimed they wouldn't be able to escape, and just as Lin Xiaoer moved forward to give the cute little beast a hug, a golden barrier suddenly flared up. The light completely separated them from the creature, which stood on a rock looking quite smug about its unique defensive skill. The creature boasted that they would never leave its formation, warning that once its subordinates arrived, they would be in serious trouble. We see Ma Hing simply raise a hand toward the heavens. Suddenly, the blue sky fills with dense clouds, and a dazzling golden sword appears. The blade pierces the clouds and tears the formation apart, leaving the little beast wondering what kind of person this human actually is. Terrified by such overwhelming sword intent, the creature freezes as Ma Hing appears behind it once more and lifts it up by the neck. He finds the creature quite amusing and suggests it come with him for a better life, but the beast insists all humans are cunning liars. It fears that following him means being eaten, though Ma Hing notes that its tiny frame wouldn't even be enough to get stuck in his teeth. The little beast tries to look pitiful, convinced he wants to eat it, but Ma Hing decides he has had enough talk for one day. He grabs it firmly, preparing to take it back with him, when suddenly a thunderous roar echoes across the sky. A voice demands the human release the beast or face death, just as a dark red figure begins to descend with terrifying speed. The sheer pressure of its arrival sends Lin Xiaoer flying back. To her horror, the intruder is a formidable one-horned magic dragon. Relying on its dragon lineage, its power rivals that of a void-returning stage expert, yet Ma Hing doesn't seem bothered at all. He casually tilts his head back for a few deep gulps of wine before handing the little spirit beast over to Lin Xiaoer. Lin Xiaoer clutches the beast and hides to the side, watching the great perfection stage dragon with absolute terror in her eyes. The oppressive dragon lets out a wild laugh as heavenly thunder gathers for miles, making the scene look like the end of the world. As the surrounding bamboo forest is leveled, Maheng looks up calmly, and dozens of immortal swords rise into the air to hover around him. Black lightning crashes down, striking fear into every living soul nearby, fear that Lin Xiaoer only escapes thanks to Maheng's protective spiritual energy. Without that protection, she would have surely perished. Meanwhile, Maheng commands the swords to merge into a single, chilling beam of light. This blade's power even surpasses the divine thunder, and though the dragon finally feels a flicker of true fear, it is far too late to run. Maheng swings downward with force, and the dragon lets out a heart-wrenching roar of agony as the strike connects. The dragon's once confident aura shatters into a desperate cry, and Maheng simply turns to the girl, suggesting it is time for them to go. We return to the outskirts of the forest of myriad beasts, where Zhang Feng and Li Nan are looking anxiously at an elder they call master. They urge him to go inside and search, while the elder, Pang Zhenlong, keeps his eyes closed and remains focused on a single dog. The dog sits there quietly, seemingly out of place in such a dangerous environment. It remains still, watching the group with an expression that is almost too knowing for an animal. The creature doesn't move an inch, even as the tension among the cultivators continues to rise. It is a strange sight, to be sure, a simple dog standing guard at the edge of a legendary forest. Elder Huang Zhenlong closes his eyes and begins calculating with his fingers, stating that if Xiaoer isn't back in an hour, they will move. Fortunately, they don't have to wait long, as a flash of light suddenly appears before the three of them. Huang Zhenlong immediately adopts a respectful posture, introducing himself as an elder of the Yunshan sect and greeting the newcomer. Lin Xiaoer rushes to his side, but Huang Zhenlong only shoots her a glare, muttering that she does nothing but cause him trouble. He admits he is relieved she is safe, as he wouldn't know how to face her father otherwise, before turning back to Maheng. He thanks the senior for protecting his headstrong disciple, though Maheng casually dismisses it as a simple task and asks for his name. Huang Zhenlong is a man of status within the Fire God Kingdom and knows every powerhouse, yet he has no memory of this young man. Maheng simply waves a hand, introducing himself as Li Maheng, but politely declining to reveal his origins or sect. Huang Zhenlong strokes his beard thoughtfully, offering his sincere gratitude once more for the life-saving favor. He invites Maheng to visit the Yunshan sect in the Fire God Kingdom whenever he might find himself in the area. The elder repeats his thanks, emphasizing that the debt of saving his disciple is one he does not take lightly. He promises a grand reception should they meet again, and with a final farewell, we watch as Maheng begins to depart. A look of genuine admiration crosses Huang Zhenlong's face, and he decides it might be time to do a little investigating. He wonders if this mysterious man is from their land, given the delicate balance between the Fire God and Yulong kingdoms. They are also ancient enemies, willing to shed blood over resources despite the formal treaties signed between the two nations. Inside the main hall of the Qingxian sect, we find Huang Ting staring at a jade slip, wondering why Li Maheng's life token hasn't shattered yet. He wonders if the man is still alive, which shouldn't be possible, considering the special powder he left on the slip to attract deadly beasts. Dan Yangzi remains indifferent, suggesting they set the matter aside, as a genius from the upper sect will be visiting in 3 months. He encourages Huang Teng to work hard, noting that this visiting genius is a renowned beauty and quite a catch, if he can manage it. Huang Teng nods, already imagining a glorious future, when suddenly a mocking voice rings out from the entrance of the hall. We see Maheng stagger inside, looking quite drunk, while a furious Huang Teng points a finger at him in disbelief. Outraged by the intrusion, Huang Teng barks at him for his audacity before stepping forward to grab Maheng by the collar. But a second later, a sharp slap sends Huang Teng stumbling back, and as he recovers, he moves to summon his immortal sword. However, Dan Yangzi stops him, turning his attention to Maheng and noting that he was supposed to be in the forest of myriad beasts. When asked why he returned so soon, Maheng simply replies that he finished his task, a claim that makes Dan Yangzi raise an eyebrow. The sect leader decides he would like to see exactly what kind of trophies Maheng has managed to bring back from his journey. He remarks that given Maheng's supposed strength, the spoils of his hunt should be something truly impressive. He warns that if the items are mediocre, Maheng will be deemed a failure, which, as we know, carries a rather heavy price. The penalty is a century spent guarding the swords, a sect rule that Maheng is surely well aware of by now. Maheng calmly asks if they have ever heard of the one-horn magic dragon, prompting a burst of mocking laughter from Huang Teng. Huang Teng scoffs that it's a top-tier beast whose scales even a mid-void stage cultivator couldn't pierce, hardly a fair fight for Maheng. He goes so far as to say he'll call Maheng father if he actually pulled it off, while a grim-faced Dan Yangzi warns him not to boast. Without a word, Maheng waves his hand, and the massive corpse of the one-horn magic dragon slams onto the floor. As Huang Teng stares in absolute shock, Maheng can't help but ask if he's ready to start calling him father yet. Huang Teng's face turns an incredibly sour shade of red as Maheng asks if the trial is finally over and if his uncle has any other complaints. He suggests they go speak with his master, then shoots a knowing glance at Huang Teng regarding the strange powder left on the flying sword. He notes that while the powder was clearly meant to attract deadly beasts, it was utterly useless against a void stage powerhouse like himself. Out of respect for his master, he decides not to pursue the matter this time, but he leaves the warning hanging as he turns his back on them. Trembling with rage and clutching his swollen cheek, Wang Tung begs his master to seek justice for the humiliation he just endured. But Dan Yangzi is already at his breaking point, snapping at his disciple and calling him a useless fool for failing such a simple task. Deeply disappointed in his student, the sect leader leaves, while we return to Ma Hing's quarters where he places the small beast on the table. He reassures the creature that no one will hurt it here, offering 30 mid-grade spirit snacks as a welcoming gift. The little beast wags its tail in pure delight at the sight of the snacks. Meanwhile, a much more serious meeting is about to take place. Lung Qianing has finally finished her secluded meditation, and it isn't long before a frustrated Dan Yangzi comes seeking her out. She asks if he has come specifically to disturb her peace, while Dan Yangzi complains bitterly about the lack of respect shown to him. He fumes that the disciple was far too arrogant, claiming he was insulted in front of a crowd without any regard for seniority. She asks him if he truly doesn't understand why he was treated that way, leaving the sect leader momentarily speechless and annoyed. He wonders aloud if he, the leader of the Qingxian sect, is truly forbidden from disciplining a mere disciple under his own roof. Lung Qianing retorts that while disciples can be managed, he must remember that Li Maheng is her personal student. She questions if his constant targeting of the boy is actually a sign of hidden resentment toward her, reminding him of her promise to their late master. She admits his recent behavior has been a great disappointment, and as she speaks, a chilling pressure begins to fill the room. Feeling the cold intent, Dan Yangzi quickly insists he only wants to protect the sect's future, hoping she will believe his sincerity. He even offers to swear an oath before their master's memorial, which finally causes Lung Qianing's expression to soften slightly. He then changes the subject, mentioning that in 2 months, a genius from the upper sect will be arriving at the Qingxian sect. Dan Yangzi explains that he wants Wang Tung to get to know this visitor, but Lung Qianing nearly laughs out loud at the suggestion. She asks him if he truly believes that a heavenly genius from the upper sect would ever take an interest in his disciple, Wang Tung. Dan Yangzi looks quite displeased. After all, it's insulting to hear that the student he spent a century raising to the deity transformation stage is so lowly. We soon see Ma Heng receiving a summons from his master, and he makes his way to the main house carrying the little auspicious beast. He greets his master respectfully, while Lung Qianing stares at the creature, her brow twitching as she realizes its true identity. There is, after all, only one such beast in the East Lin Southern Province, and the creature recognizes her too, realizing who she is. The beast mentions having seen her before and demands that she tell her disciple to immediately unseal its cultivation base. It insists on going back home, but Lung Qianing simply chuckles and tells the creature it will have to beg Ma Heng itself. She reminds the beast that it is, technically speaking, her disciple's trophy, before a cup of tea suddenly appears before Ma Heng. She asks if he is aware that the genius of the upper sect will be visiting their Qingxian sect in 2 months' time. Ma Heng assures her he won't let her down, but she shakes her head, wondering if he knows about his senior brother Wang Tung's plans. Apparently, Wang Ting hopes to form a connection with this genius, and Ma Heng can't help but curl his lip at the idea. He notes that these geniuses are usually at the void refinement stage and are protected by guardians as powerful as his own master. His next comment is so blunt that Lung Qianing can't help but burst out laughing. He asks if Wang Tung is actually mentally ill. He suggests that given Wang Tung's looks, the man should look in a mirror, as he's likely only fit to wash the visitor's feet. Lung Qianing covers her mouth and laughs, telling Ma Heng he is truly an amusing child, though Wang Tung would be livid if he heard. This is the first time we see the master laugh, and Ma Heng finds her unexpectedly beautiful and moving in this moment. Realizing she has lost her composure slightly, she composes herself and tells him he may leave until it is time to welcome the guest. Ma Heng acknowledges the order, telling her to call for him whenever needed, and with that, our scene begins to shift forward. 2 months pass in the blink of an eye, and we see the disciples of the Qingxian sect gathering at the plaza to welcome the genius. Dan Yangzi strokes his beard and tells Wang Tung that everything now depends on him. He believes that if Wang Tung can marry the genius of the upper sect, his future status will be unrivaled. Wang Tung confidently assures his master that he won't fail, before casting a cold, sharp glance toward the side. We see Ma Heng completely ignoring the tension, casually lifting his wine flask to take another long drink. He mutters that fine wine is better than any tribute to heaven, a sentiment that, to be honest, seems quite fitting for him. Suddenly, a 7-colored rainbow bridge appears in the sky, carrying dozens of men and women dressed in pristine white robes. Dan Yangzi leads Wang Tung forward to greet them, and the leading woman gives the sect leader a brief, calculating look. She introduces herself as Nailin Yinran, the genius of the Xinxian sect, and addresses Dan Yangzi as her senior uncle. Dan Yangzi smiles and introduces Wang Tung as his own disciple, claiming he is the pride of the Qingxian sect. Nailin Yinran merely offers a slight nod before walking straight past them toward Lung Qianing. She greets Lung Qianing with deep respect, mentioning that her own master sent her to deliver his warmest regards. Lung Qianing tells her there is no need for such formality and asks after her master's well-being, which Nailin confirms is excellent. After thanking the elder for her concern, Nalan Yinran's gaze shifts and settles on the young man standing beside Lung Qianing. Lung Qianing introduces him as her troublesome disciple, Mahing, and at that name, Nalan Yinran's eyes suddenly light up. A strange spark of interest flickers in her gaze as she admits she has heard of him and his feats during the great competition. She recalls how he defeated many geniuses and even killed Lu Longshan. Mahing simply smiles and waves it off as nothing. Dan Yangzi tries to intervene with a chuckle, mentioning that he has arranged a banquet for their honored guests. He suggests that Wang Teng should show her around, but Nalan Yinran politely declines the offer without a second thought. She explains that she would rather discuss the truths of cultivation with Mahing, leaving Dan Yangzi looking quite frustrated. He simply cannot understand why everyone seems to revolve around Mahing, while Lung Qianing watches with a knowing smile. Lung Qianing suggests that Mahing take Nalan Yinran for a stroll nearby, and as they walk away, we see the others watching their retreating figures. Wang Teng's face turns dark with pure frustration, but then, a sudden thought seems to cross his mind. He shifts his gaze toward Nalan Yinran's maid, Cui Ling, thinking that perhaps she might be the breakthrough he needs. Wearing a practiced smile, he approaches her and asks if she is indeed the famous Cui Ling. He asks if she would do him the honor of letting him show her the beautiful sights of the Qingxian sect, leaving Cui Ling quite surprised. It is the first time a genius has ever invited her anywhere, and she wonders if he has fallen for her, a thought that makes her nod proudly. She tells him she will give him a chance, while nearby, Dan Yangzi frowns and sends a telepathic message asking his disciple what he is doing. He had told him to pursue Nalan Yinran, so he cannot understand why he is looking at a mere maid. Wang Teng simply offers a dark smile. He tells his master not to worry, explaining that the girl is nothing more than a pawn in his larger game. He plans to win twice over, noting that Cui Ling seems like an innocent girl who is just beginning to understand the matters of the heart. Wang Teng believes a few sweet words will make her happy enough to serve him until he finally secures Nalan Yinran. To be honest, his plan to simply kick the girl aside later is quite ruthless, but Dan Yangzi strokes his beard, thoroughly satisfied with his disciple. We move to the mountainside, where the peaks are shrouded in mist and the lake water is so clear one can see right to the bottom. The light shimmers off the water between towering cliffs that shine like jewels as the evening sun casts a golden glow across the horizon. A small boat appears in the middle of the lake, drifting slowly forward through the golden reflections. Mahing takes a sip of his wine and looks at the scenery, softly reciting a poem about the mountains floating on the mirror-like water. He remarks that the bamboo forest is a truly wonderful place, and Nalan Yinran looks around at the beauty surrounding them. She offers a rare, genuine smile. As a genius of the upper sect, she spends her days training and rarely sees the world. Now that she has come to the Qingxian sect, she finds herself completely captivated by the landscape before her. Mahing notes that while this is one of the sect's most beautiful spots, very few people ever come here, which makes one wonder why. Nalan Yinran asks with a touch of curiosity why this place, with such thin spiritual energy, isn't part of the main Qingxian mountain range. Very few people are willing to cultivate here, and as Nalan Yinran senses the surroundings, she finds that it is exactly as Mahing described. The spiritual energy is pitifully sparse. She picks a bouquet of flowers from the water and softly remarks that it is a pity. Mahing notes that whether it be people or all living things, everything withers with time, unless, of course, she wishes to preserve their beauty. He suggests he has a plan, and as Nalan Yinran turns around, he observes that her spiritual root must be of the exquisite ice attribute. Since her spiritual root is so precious, he suggests she create a floral garment by letting her ice energy naturally coat the petals. By following her heart, she could not only preserve the beauty of the flowers, but keep them in their original state forever. Nalan Yinran listens and begins to circulate her energy, causing an icy blue mist to rise from her hands, though her initial control is a bit too strong. The petals crack and dissipate into the breeze, but Mahing isn't surprised. It was her first attempt, after all, and these things take time. Nalan Yinran quietly takes his words to heart, deciding then and there to master the control of her ice attribute's spiritual root. Ling seemed so free and unconstrained that Nalan Yinran couldn't help but feel a deep sense of curiosity toward him. Noticing the bamboo flute in her hand, he smiled and remarked on how perfectly it suited the mountain scenery. The atmosphere was just right, and Nalan Yinran softly replied that since he was in such high spirits, she would play a tune. She brought the flute to her lips, and a clear, elegant melody began to drift through the air like the cry of a phoenix. It was a beautiful sound, and he laughed heartily before tilting his gourd back for a long, satisfying drink. She glanced at him with a playful smile, asking what he thought, while he simply continued to laugh in his wild, carefree way. The ancients said a woman's beauty is rooted in grace, carried with elegance, and refined by art. And in this moment, Nalan Yinran proved that her charm was truly extraordinary as she moved with sudden purpose. With her flute held tight, she charged toward him, a challenge he accepted with one last gulp of wine. He drew his blade to meet her, and the resulting impact sent massive plumes of lake water surging into the sky. Watching this from a distance, Wang Teng's teeth were nearly grinding to dust as he glared at Mahing, cursing him in his heart. He wondered why Mahing had to steal everything he desired, vowing that once he reached the next realm, it would be Mahing's end. As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in dark hues and the water in shimmering light, we see Mahung and Nalan Yinran standing side by side. Nalan Yinran spoke softly, revealing that their visit to the Qingxian sect wasn't merely for a friendly exchange of skills. They needed to head to the Nether Spirit Valley, where a peerless treasure had reportedly appeared, and her master had ordered her to seize it. When asked what the treasure was, she shook her head. She only knew that the place was incredibly dangerous. A single mistake could mean death, so her master arranged for her to come here and join forces with the sect's top geniuses. Mahung wondered why they hadn't sought out other sects, but Nalan Yinran simply gave a bitter smile, implying he was the reason. He rubbed his nose, barely remembering his drunken exploits, though he knew he had eliminated the poison prince, Qin Wuyan, of the Le Gate. Nalan Yinran admitted that today's events had deeply affected her state of mind, and she planned to enter secluded cultivation once the mission ended. After they returned to the Qingxian sect to prepare for the journey ahead, Ding Yangzi arranged guest rooms for everyone and suggested that Wang Teng should look after their daily needs. Nalan Yinran declined the offer, and later, in the quiet of her room, her maid Cooling spoke up while tidying the bed. She warned the princess to stay away from Lin Mong, claiming he was a bad person, a comment that Nalan Yinran found quite insulting. With a tone of clear dissatisfaction, Nalan Yinran listened as Cooling claimed that Mahung had recently harassed a female disciple. Supposedly, everyone in the Qingxian sect knew, but Nalan Yinran frowned, certain that Mahung was simply not that kind of man. Even though they had only known each other a day, she felt she understood his character, yet Cooling continued her warnings. The maid insisted that this information came directly from Wang Teng himself, mentioning a woman named Lu Rian. Deep down, Nalan Yinran suspected a smear campaign, wondering why a fellow genius of the same sect would resort to such slander. As Cooling prepared the bathwater, she continued to press the issue, hoping the princess would take her words to heart. Cooling insisted that some people hide their true nature deep within, and one shouldn't judge by appearances alone, especially given Mahung's strength. She suggested his power made such actions against a female disciple plausible, but Nalan Yinran cut her off with a sharp, low command to stop. She asked why Cooling, who was usually so reserved, had so much to say today, causing the maid to lower her head in fear. Cooling stammered that she simply didn't want her mistress to be deceived, but she was told to leave and never mention the matter again. Not daring to say another word, Cooling withdrew. Though she felt her goal was achieved, she had done exactly what Wang Ting asked of her. Even if the princess seemed skeptical now, a seed of doubt had been planted, and such things are rarely easy to uproot once they take hold. The next day, we find ourselves at the Qingxian sect square, where many disciples of the Xinxian sect have already gathered in anticipation. Two young geniuses stepped forward with playful smirks, claiming they had long heard of the formidable strength found within the Qingxian sect. They asked who would represent the sect, and after a quick glance from Danyangzi, Wang Teng stepped up and cupped his hands in greeting. He introduced himself as Wang Teng, the head disciple of the Qingxian sect, currently at the early stage of the spirit-severing realm. Breaking through to such a level within 100 years was certainly an achievement, but the visitors wondered who else would be joining them. Shun Xiuzhu, a disciple from Little Bamboo Peak, then leaped into the center of the square to greet the fellow cultivators as a nascent soul beginner. One of the newcomers raised an eyebrow, his gaze flickering with a hint of envy. Reaching the nascent soul stage in one's 20s was rare, even in the great sects. This man was Li Pingho, a genius of the Xinxian sect at the late spirit-severing stage, who noted that someone was still missing. He recalled there was one more genius in the Qingxian sect, yet as time passed and no one answered, Ding Yangzi's brow began to furrow with worry. He questioned Lung Qianing about the delay, but she remained expressionless, simply suggesting that they wait a little longer. She assumed he was likely drunk again, a habit of her disciple that she had long since grown accustomed to, for better or worse. As long as he didn't break sect rules or harm the innocent, she was prepared to protect him, though the guests were far less patient. The disciples of the Xinxian sect had not expected such blatant arrogance from a member of the Qingxian sect, and their dissatisfaction began to grow. As the murmurs of discontent spread through the crowd, Cooling took the opportunity to whisper more poisoned words into the princess's ear. Cooling whispered to the princess, asking if she saw now that Lin Mahung was exactly the kind of person who would act so shamelessly toward a female disciple. Hearing her words, Wang Ting couldn't help but smile, silently praying that Mahung would take as long as possible to arrive. Just as the crowd's indignation began to boil over, a lazy voice echoed from the distance, drawing everyone's eyes toward the source. We see Mahung swaying as he approaches, reeking of alcohol after spending the entire night drinking at the foot of the mountain. He had only just remembered the sparring match. Shin Shuazhu rushed forward, asking exactly how much he had managed to drink this time. With a faint smile, he held up a single finger, admitting he had been drinking since the previous evening, a revelation that made the crowd facepalm in unison. No one expected that Mahung would have spent the whole night drinking, and Li Pingho watched the swaying young man with a look of pure disbelief. Wang Teng took the opportunity to kick him while he was down, mockingly asking if this was truly the Qingxian sect's top genius. He labeled him a genius who only knew how to drink. Li Pingho stepped forward, trying to peer into Mahung's cultivation, only to find his internal state obscured. It was as if his realm was shrouded in a thick mist, impossible to see through. Li Pingho introduced himself as a genius of the Xinxian sect. He was at the late spirit-severing stage, while his companion, Fang Jingtian, introduced himself as being at the mid-spirit-severing stage. The two cupped their hands as Ma Hing introduced himself as a disciple of the Qingxian sect at the early void refinement stage, greeting them both. Li Pingho's expression turned strange as he exchanged a confused glance with Fang Jingtian, who spoke up in a low, surprised voice. He admitted he hadn't expected Ma Hing's cultivation to be so terrifyingly high, expressing his genuine admiration. Finally, he turned to Leng Qianing and bowed, suggesting they were ready to begin, to which she gave a simple nod of approval. As she looked at the three of them, Shen Xuezhu raised her hand, asking her master for permission to test her own skills first. Though she was only at the nascent soul stage, she wanted to see the gap between herself and the geniuses of the upper sect. Leng Qianing didn't refuse, as it was merely a friendly spar where no serious injuries were expected to occur. The Xinxian sect genius noted that since the lady was so interested, he would be happy to exchange a few moves with her. Suddenly, Shen Xuezhu charged forward with the speed of a lightning bolt, her sword light piercing through the very air. But Li Pingho simply sidestepped the attack, flicking his folding fan to unleash a surge of energy that forced her back. He remarked that her speed was impressive, comparable to the peak of the nascent soul stage, but still insufficient against a spirit-severing expert. Shen Xuezhu replied that he was too kind, but the real test was only just beginning as her form began to shift and blur. She moved like a flicker of light and shadow, her movements becoming increasingly difficult to track with the naked eye. It was a display of agility that seemed to defy the limits of her physical body as she prepared for her true strike. We see Shen Xuezhu weaving through the air like a phantom, a sight that was truly difficult to believe for those watching. This speed was on par with a spirit-severing powerhouse. Wang Teng watched with a furrowed brow, recognizing the technique. It was the divine oil step, the Qingxian sect's ultimate movement technique, which allows a master to move leaving only after images. Wang Teng's concern grew, knowing that this profound technique was supposed to be a secret known only to Leng Qianing herself. He hadn't expected her to pass it to Shen Xuezhu. Meanwhile, Li Pingho finally began to take the fight seriously. He wasn't worried about her speed, but rather the flag-like energy within her sword wings, so he swapped his fan for a 3-meter staff. Golden runes flashed as spiritual sword qi poured down from the sky, and the two forces collided in a massive explosion of energy. The sword wings were scattered, and against such absolute power, Shen Xuezhu was eventually pushed back hundreds of meters. She had clearly lost the exchange, yet Li Pingho felt no joy as he reached up to touch his right cheek. He found a small cut he hadn't even noticed. A nascent soul cultivator had actually managed to wound him, which was simply unbelievable. Shen Xuezhu thought to herself that her senior uncle's sword-wing teachings were indeed powerful, even if the level gap was too wide to overcome. Fang Jingtian noticed the scratch on Li Pingho's face and jumped onto the platform, telling his companion to step down and leave the rest to him. Wang Teng also leapt onto the stage, cupping his hands and signaling that he was ready to proceed with the next match. Fang Jingtian's face twisted into a sneer, mocking him for being only at the early spirit-severing stage as he released a massive wave of spiritual pressure. The cultivators below the spirit-severing realm gasped in shock, their nascent souls trembling under the weight of such overwhelming power. Wang Ting opened his mouth to spit out a purple immortal sword, a sight that left even Dan Yangzi quite surprised. It seems he hadn't expected Leng Qianing to actually entrust her personal immortal sword to Wang Teng, as Dan Yangzi noted with a serious expression. He countered by asking if she hadn't also given her frost-cold sword to Ling Shiji. Meanwhile, on the stage, Wang Teng launched his first strike. The sword's glow sliced through the void, and as Fang Jingtian dodged, a purple-black curved blade appeared, aiming straight for Wang Teng's chest. Wang Teng retreated, his hands dancing as he summoned dozens of phantom sword glows to attack, forcing Fang Jingtian to swing his blade in defense. Each collision left behind an ear-piercing explosion, and while keeping his opponent occupied, Wang Teng began to form hand seals. Suddenly, Fang Jingtian's body vanished into thin air, and before Wang Teng could even react, the entire stage was filled with the power of thunder. Dark clouds gathered as lightning crackled, the 100-mile divine thunder, and two purple-black lightning serpents tore through the sky. They shot toward Wang Teng with explosive force, but he simply tapped his forehead, causing a single drop of crimson blood to fly out. That drop split into countless others, transforming into demonic beasts that charged into the lightning in a chain of self-destructing spiritual energy. With the thunder blocked, Wang Teng spotted a figure above the clouds and used his left hand to control the remaining explosions. His right hand guided the Zixiao sword in a rapid strike, its qi splitting the very air in two, causing Fang Jingtian's expression to pale. Unable to dodge in time, the Zixiao sword slammed into his abdomen, and with a sharp cry of pain, he sprayed out a mouthful of blood. His body fell like a bird with broken wings, crashing heavily onto the plaza while Wang Teng stood trembling, his eyes bloodshot. A wave of weakness washed over him. He had reached his limit, and he knew that without his master's demonic beast surprise, he might have lost. Li Pingho rushed forward to demand an explanation, asking why Wang Teng had struck with such excessive force. Wang Teng replied indifferently that he was merely giving his all, as an early spirit-severing cultivator must fight for his life to survive such thunder. Left speechless, Li Pingho could only administer a pill to Fong Jingtian. With the score tied at 1 win and 1 loss, the tension was palpable. If Nalan Yanran were to lose as well, the sect's reputation would be in tatters, while Dan Yangzi laughed, proud of his disciple's performance. He told Wang Tung to rest and leave the next match to his junior brother, glancing over at me, the one who had already fallen fast asleep in my chair. Mei Feng frowned, clearly dissatisfied with such a nonchalant attitude, until Sheng Shuzu finally managed to wake the sleeping disciple. Opening his eyes to glance at the two who had finished fighting, he let out a deep stretch as Sheng Shuzu warned him to be careful. She reminded him that Nalan Yanran was a genius of the high sect, and her strength was undeniably formidable. He simply carried his wine gourd onto the stage, tilting his head back to take a carefree, spirited gulp of the spirits. Nalan Yanran watched him with a polite smile, gripping her bamboo flute as she asked if he was truly in a fit state to fight. He merely waved his hand. Strangely enough, his spiritual power actually seemed to sharpen while he was in this drunken state. As Nalan Yanran lifted her right foot and touched the ground, the stage began to transform at a speed visible to the naked eye. A layer of frost spread rapidly in all directions, and looking down at the ice, he offered a calm, knowing smile. The girl's strength was truly formidable. We see her frost not only boosting her own power, but steadily draining her opponent's spiritual energy. A silver-white immortal sword appeared in her hand as her spiritual power surged. Clearly, Nalan Yanran was not taking him lightly. She had witnessed his swordsmanship against Hu Zhong yesterday and knew his strength was easily at a peak level in the region. He laughed heartily, speaking of wandering the world where the clouds and the sword meet, or perhaps where they don't. With a laugh at the world, he raised his hand, and countless immortal swords rose into the air, appearing deceptively ordinary at first. But a closer look revealed an extreme energy within the sword chi, causing the experts of the high sect to look up in surprise. Their brows furrowed as they felt a tremor in their hearts, while Nalan Yanran placed the flute to her lips and began to play. As the sound waves rippled and her robes fluttered, he pointed his finger toward the heavens, commanding the sword light to fall. The swords descended like a torrential rain, and as Nalan Yanran intensified her melody, the sound waves formed a protective barrier. The barrier surrounded her body, and we hear the constant, crisp sound of collisions as sparks flew in every direction. She extended a finger to reinforce the barrier with ice blue energy, yet the flying swords continued to strike with relentless force. Seeing her defense hold firm, he simply raised his wine jar again, drinking deeply as the clear liquor dripped from the corner of his mouth. Brushing her robes, Nalan Yanran could clearly feel that his strength was steadily rising with every passing second. As he finished another jar of wine, the system's voice echoed in his mind, rewarding him with the mastery of the drunken sword immortal. The sword intent of Hongming began to shroud the very heavens, manifesting a technique that looked like a literal world-ending catastrophe. Li Pingho watched in absolute shock, realizing this man was an anomaly of the void refinement stage, while his own gaze grew steady and firm. He nodded toward Nalan Yanran, warning her that he was about to get serious, while she calmly tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. With a faint smile, she invited him to give it his all, eager to witness his true power as the sword immortal's aura rose into the clouds. As his voice fell, 10,000 swords seemed to become one, ready to sweep across the Green Mountains in a single, devastating motion. The swords of the Qingxian sect disciples suddenly flew toward him, completely out of control, and even the weapons of the high sect disciples were caught in the pull. The blades merged frantically in the air. Elder Huiyun watched with wide eyes, recognizing the very move that had once ended Zhao Yuanhao. But this time, the power was hundreds, perhaps thousands of times greater than before, as the immortal swords within the sword seed began to stir. The ancient swords immersed in that sacred place flew out like startled swans, leaving the sword seed elders to simply shake their heads in weary resignation. They wondered if this was a blessing or a curse, knowing a youth with such terrifying talent would surely be targeted by everyone in the future. High atop a stone pillar, a white-haired elder slowly opened his eyes, forming hand seals to divine the young man's future path. He looked toward the horizon of time, seeing only a chaotic haze ahead and a haunting void behind the boy's footsteps. Deep down, he knew this was an omen of great misfortune. His face grew solemn as he moved to warn Lung Qining, only to be stopped. He was told it was forbidden to interfere with fate, for this was the boy's own tribulation, and the secrets of heaven must never be leaked. Back on the stage, his sword chi refused to yield even an inch before the massive ice phoenix summoned by Nalan Yanran's power. An ice-blue shadow soared from behind Nalan Yanran, circling through the sky until it fully manifested as a majestic, frozen bird of legend. It was a sight of pure, holy power, leaving trails of freezing blue energy in its wake as it glided through the heavens. A massive tornado, hundreds of meters high, began to form. His expression turned serious as he prepared to face the descending ice phoenix. We see the true power of Nalan Yanran, the ice fairy, as her majestic ice phoenix takes its final, terrifying form. Even the elders realized with a shock that they might be no match for her, as Yanran raised her hand to strike. The ice phoenix charged straight ahead, but he remained expressionless, simply pressing his large hand downward toward the earth. A giant sword pierced the clouds and fell vertically. Under its sheer pressure, the mountain gates shattered and boulders began to tumble. The Qingxian sect shook violently as the ice phoenix struck the sword's glow, instantly shattering into countless fragments before vanishing entirely. The sword's light didn't stop there, sweeping directly toward Nalan Yanran, though the massive blade halted just above her head. With her current spiritual power, she couldn't have endured the impact. Nalan Yanran sighed softly and admitted her defeat. The high sect disciples were stunned that their senior sister couldn't last more than a few rounds, while he simply held his wine gourd. With a wave of his sleeve, the giant sword dissolved into 10,000 smaller blades, each returning to its rightful owner. Lung Qining nodded with great satisfaction as Nalan Yanran gave a deep, respectful bow to the assembly. Lung Qining looked toward him, and he accepted the task. The Nether Spirit Valley was one of the few truly dangerous places in the south. But with its countless treasures, it was the perfect place to find herbs for his strongest wine, and so, the plan was set. Lung Qining warned him that the valley was treacherous, urging him not to go too deep if danger arose. Suddenly, Wang Teng stepped forward to volunteer, insisting to his master that he was also willing to go on this journey. As Wang Teng recommended himself, Nalan Yanran prepared to refuse, but her attendant Chui Ling whispered a quick reminder. Chui Ling suggested that since Wang Teng defeated Fang Jingtian, his skills might actually be useful to them. Yanran eventually agreed. A cold glint appeared in Wang Teng's eyes as he plotted to abandon his rival in the valley. After all, he wanted Yanran for himself. Half a day later, several figures took to the sky in front of the main hall, ready to depart for the unknown. To ensure their safety, the Qingxian sect arranged for an elder of the body integration stage named Di Junwan to accompany them. This elder of the Qingxian sect appeared to be only in her 20s, which, in this world, usually means she is incredibly formidable. Still thinking only of his plum wine, Imo Hung sprawled across his immortal sword, taking a sip every now and then with impressive dedication. If he ever awakened a 9-sword immortal system, he'd likely outshine everyone. Meanwhile, Di Junwan approached and beckoned him over. She called out for Imo Hung to join her, and as he steered his flying sword toward her, he wondered what his elder required. Di Junwan patted the spot beside her, inviting him to sit for a chat, so he landed right next to her to listen. She mentioned hearing of his love for plum wine and demanded to see just how many years his current batch had aged. Before he could even react, she snatched the wine gourd from his waist and took several deep, enthusiastic gulps. It pained him to watch. That was 1,000-year-old Luosing wine, a rare treasure he had traded from a high sect messenger. He asked her what she thought she was doing, reminding her that this specific vintage was nearly impossible to replace. He quickly snatched it back, but she simply laughed, telling him not to be so stingy since they were practically family. She demanded he pour her half, but he simply turned his head away, and that was when Wang Teng decided to intervene. Wang Teng stepped forward, offering a jar of his own fine wine, which immediately caught Di Junwan's wandering attention. The aroma filled the air, but as soon as Di Junwan took a sip, her brow furrowed in immediate and visible disappointment. With a look of pure disgust, she tossed the jar down from the clouds, telling him never to bring her such trash again. Wang Teng's face soured as he retreated, and seeing Di Junwan about to bother Nalan Yanran for wine, Imo Hung spoke up quickly. He offered her another jar aged for 800 years to keep her occupied, provided she stopped eyeing his precious Luosang wine. He handed it over with great reluctance, noting it was a gift from his master, while Di Junwan couldn't wait to start drinking. A single sip left her looking utterly satisfied. 3 days later, they sat by a campfire where beef was sizzling over the flames. Di Junwan licked her lips, reminding Imo Hung that as his elder, it was only right that she should eat the best parts first. She insisted on tasting it for him, but he told her to wait, warning her that if she insisted on eating now, he simply wouldn't add any of his special seasonings to the meat, leaving Di Junwan to pout with her hands on her hips. Imo Hung muttered that he'd definitely settle the score with his senior sister later, reminding Di Junwan that their master had given him a specific warning. If she continued to be difficult, he was authorized to leave her behind halfway. Di Junwan took a deep breath and told him to go ahead and eat first. She claimed she would be satisfied just smelling the aroma, and after the meal, she fell fast asleep, completely indifferent to what anyone thought of her. Wang Teng was fuming with indignation, wondering why he had to pull night watch while the others slept. He glared at them as they snored away. His whole body twitched with irritation as he thought they were a perfect match as master and disciple. 3 days later, they finally reached the border. Even before entering the Nether Spirit Valley, we can feel the eerie and terrifying atmosphere. Di Junwan used her bare foot to poke Imo Hang's cheek. She told him to wake up because they had arrived, and as he opened his eyes, he saw her toes rubbing against his face. He complained that she was going too far, but Di Junwan just gave a mischievous laugh, noting she'd done the same thing days ago with no complaints. She turned her gaze to the group and announced that they had arrived, explaining that from this point on, they were strictly on their own. She made it clear she wouldn't intervene unless their lives were in danger, and strictly forbade them from entering the inner depths of the valley. Even powerful experts might not survive in there, she warned, telling them not to be foolish enough to rush inside blindly. Di Junwan approached Imo Hung privately, telling him to be careful and not to let the poisonous miasma cloud his soul. She added that even if she didn't act, the expert from the Divine Profound sect wouldn't let these children come to any harm. Mo Hung also sensed a presence in the clouds, an early-stage spirit, severing cultivator, a testament to the divine profound sect's hidden strength. Di Junwan sent a private message warning him to watch out for Wang Tong, who was no good, before handing out jade slips to everyone. These contained her divine sense. If they encountered danger, they were to crush them immediately, so she could find them instantly. As they entered the Nether Spirit Valley, the sky turned dark and danger lurked everywhere, with venomous snakes and insects crawling in the shadows. Suddenly, a cold voice drifted from ahead, mocking the group and identifying them as fellow cultivators from the divine profound sect. A group of men dressed in black and red robes emerged from the gloom, their presence immediately putting everyone on edge. Their leader was a man of hideous appearance, clutching a silver scimitar and staring at Nalan Yanran and the others with a predatory smile. It turns out to be Duya, the young master of the Corpse Poetry sect, a group infamous for refining puppets known as poetry corpses. The souls of these puppets are sealed forever, trapped in a state where they can neither live nor die, while Duya simply laughs at the horror of it. He claims they are there for the same reason as everyone else, while Nalan Yanran sends a private message explaining the sect's dark history. The Corpse Poetry sect is notorious throughout Shinyo Hajo, and Duya's own strength has reached the extraordinary void returning stage. With a father at the loose immortal realm, Duya glances at Li Pingho, mocking the two young soul transformation cultivators for their misplaced bravery. He taunts them for not knowing their limits, but then reveals he isn't the one looking for them. Someone else is, and he calls them forward. A man in a white mask emerges from the crowd, introducing himself as the Taoist Mi, one of the 5 poison guardians of the Luhe Gate. Taoist Mi addresses our protagonist directly, asking if he is indeed the celebrated genius of the Qingxian sect, Mo Hung. He mentions that Mo Hung likely killed his junior brother, Qin Wuyan, but Mo Hung remains calm, simply asking if he's looking for revenge. Taoist Mi shakes his head, noting that in the cultivation world, power is supreme and his brother's fate was simply his own misfortune. He explains that he has come because he requires a small favor from a fellow cultivator of Mo Hang's caliber. Inside the Nether Spirit Valley lives a rare insect called the Purple Nether. Eating its eggs can vastly increase one's power, but there is a catch. If the larvae hatch, they will consume a person's internal organs from the inside out until nothing remains. As a specialized treasure bottle appears, Duya suggests they join forces to enter the depths of the valley together. Nalan Yanran coldly refuses the offer, as a righteous disciple would never stoop to working alongside the demonic sects. She leads the group forward, leaving the villains behind, though Wang Ting clearly has his own secret plans as they reach a fork in the road. The group comes to a silent halt, and when Wang Tong suggests they split up to search, Nalan Yanran agrees to divide into 4 teams. Chui Ling quickly grabs Wang Tong, insisting they pair up, while Mo Hung simply shrugs and chooses his own path. He decides to use the opportunity to look for herbs, bidding the others farewell before disappearing around a bend in the forest. Venturing deep into the valley alone, he remains unbothered, soon encountering a green poisonous miasma and a mid-stage soul transformation beast. From beneath the shadow of a massive jade crystal cicada, a short, hunched old man in green robes and a sharp, bird-like face emerges. He sneers, admitting that Mo Hang's strength is indeed formidable, but suggests that if he simply leaves his head behind, the old man might show mercy. He offers to let Mo Hang's soul return to his sect in exchange, but our protagonist simply notes that taking his head requires actual talent. The green-robed elder lunges with incredible speed, striking Mo Hang's chest with withered fingers, only to be blocked by the one-horned demon dragon armor. The old man is thrown back 100 feet, yet he laughs, claiming that no matter how strong the armor is, the poison has already entered his body. However, we see the poison transform into a green mist and harmlessly dissipate from Mo Hang's chest, a disappointing result for the elder, to be sure. Mo Hang calmly explains that his master left the power of the 7 great spirits within the armor, a detail he had neglected to mention earlier. With that divine protection, the poison is utterly useless, a fact that sends the green-robed elder into a fit of absolute rage. The elder reverts to his true form, a colossal jade crystal cicada, rising up as the ground for 1,000 feet around them begins to collapse. Mo Hung narrows his eyes, deciding this is the perfect moment to test the 9-sword immortal array, and opens a wine jar gifted by his master. He takes several deep gulps, feeling the celestial nectar burn as he prepares to walk the path of the sword under the clear light of the sun and moon. The 9-sword immortal array is activated, and a brilliant blue formation instantly envelopes the massive jade crystal cicada. The space for 100 feet is completely sealed off as Mo Hung calls forth the first sword of the array, Sunset. A fiery red immortal sword descends from the heavens, wreathed in flames and carved with celestial bodies, scorching the earth like a fallen sun. As the flames consume the cicada, he calls out the second sword of the 9-sword immortal array, Fengming. The sound of Fengming echoes like a haunting melody between heaven and earth, the sword leaving its sheath to transform into a radiant, 5-colored phoenix. The jade crystal cicada is left without even the strength to struggle. Its body shatters instantly, and the remains are swallowed by the lingering flames. A glowing green inner core floats in the air, which Mo Hung tucks into his storage ring. After all, a void-returning beast core is quite a rare find. He notes that refining it would yield at least 7 bottles of pills, while elsewhere, we find that Wang Tung's life has become rather difficult lately. For the past half-month, he has been hunted daily by vengeful cultivators, all of them demanding the same thing, a life for the disciples he killed. Wang Tung had absolutely no idea what was happening, and his escape talismans were nearly exhausted because every time I encountered an enemy, I would simply give them his name. After all, while Mo Hung saves the suffering, it is Wang Tung who sets the fires. Eventually, Wang Tung was forced to crush his jade pendant, summoning Di Junwan to scare off the pursuers as she glanced toward my cave. After sending Wang Tung away, Di Junwan came straight to the cave, where we find Mo Hung busy roasting meat. She sat on a rock to wash her feet, and once finished, she couldn't wait to cut off a piece of meat and toss it into her mouth. She remarked that using Wang Tung's name was quite bold, noting that the poor man would likely die of rage if he ever found out. Mo Hung felt his actions were actually quite polite, all things considered, while Di Junwan took a sip of wine and asked about the treasure. He admitted that after traveling tens of thousands of miles, there were still no clues regarding the treasure or the dead sorrow mentioned by Taoist me. Di Junwan blinked her expressive eyes, putting on a pitiful act as she asked if Mo Hung would give her any high-level magical treasures he found. She complained that despite her long life, she didn't own a single fusion-grade treasure, as everything was held by her senior sister. She argued that if he kept such a treasure, it would surely be stolen, so it would be much safer in her care. Di Junwan is famous for her thick skin, but eventually, Mo Hung agreed to give her whatever he found, a promise she met with pure joy. She immediately grabbed the roasted meat and ran off, declaring it all hers and warning him not to go back on his word. Mo Hung could only drop his spices on the ground, noting that he hadn't even added the salt yet before she vanished. A few days later, on a desolate mountain, we see him finally discover a crystal blue herb with 3 leaves and clear, intricate patterns. The herb appeared to be between 3,000 and 4,000 years old, but a nearby cave held a much more dangerous secret. Inside that cave, a massive scorpion at the peak of the void returning stage lay sleeping, guarding its territory. Even more surprising were the dozen or so purple sorrow eggs hanging from a withered tree, pulsing like blood-red jewels. Mo Hung took a moment to enjoy his wine, deciding to live in the present and ignore the troubles brewing right outside his door. But just as he was observing the scene, Lan Yanran and her group arrived, just as the Great Scorpion King transformed into human form. The Great Scorpion King stood up, noticing the intruders, and warned the human cultivators to leave immediately so he could finish his drink in peace. Lan Yanran stepped forward and cupped her hands in respect, explaining that they had come specifically in search of a secret treasure. She politely asked the king to hand it over, but Li Pingho frowned, snapping that they shouldn't waste words and should just kill him instead. The Scorpion King let out a cold snort, releasing a crushing pressure that sent Li Pingho to the ground coughing blood, forcing Lan Yanran to intervene. Her Yin-wave barrier shattered the king's spiritual pressure, and as the two sides began to clash, Mo Hung saw his chance and rushed forward. In an instant, he plucked the crystal grass and sliced down all the purple sorrow eggs with a single arrow, prompting a furious roar from the beast. Enraged, the Scorpion King abandoned Lan Yanran to chase Mo Hung, who quickly messaged her that he would lead the monster away. He told him to find the treasure while he was busy, and she nodded, warning him to be careful as the beast was nearly at the fusion stage. Mo Hung sped away with the Great Scorpion King in hot pursuit, the beast screaming for him to drop the crystal grass if he wanted to live. It was only then that he realized the grass itself was the treasure, and as the king blocked his path, Mo Hung shook his head helplessly. He lamented the loss of his precious plum wine as he began pulling every 1,000-year-old bottle from his storage ring. Though it pained him to part with such a collection, he knew it was the only way to win, so he began uncorking the jars one by one. He poured the potent liquor down his throat, and after 30 jars, the system finally announced that the 9-sword immortal effect had been triggered. His strength surged by an entire level, reaching the peak of the mid-void returning stage, leaving the Scorpion King trembling in sudden fear. Driven by survival, the king's armor turned blood red as he forced himself into a pseudo-fusion state, yet Mo Hung felt his own spiritual power was still lacking. Suddenly, Di Junwan appeared through the mist, tossing a jar of fine wine toward Mo Hung, though she clearly looked pained to give it up. He told himself that losing the wine was better than dying there, so he opened the jar and drained the contents in a single breath. The system congratulated him for consuming the 2,000-year-old Luosing wine, completing his progress toward the 9-sword immortal mastery. His cultivation broke through once again, reaching the peak of the late void returning stage, and we see him radiating a terrifying new power. The 9-sword immortal array erupted with full force, leaving the Scorpion King with no room to resist as a massive sword pinned him into the dirt. The beast died instantly, and just then, Di Junwan appeared out of thin air, casually sitting on Mo Hung's shoulder with her legs crossed. She admitted she hadn't believed he could truly gain enlightenment through drinking, but seeing was believing, as Mo Hung wiped away his sweat. He wondered why she hadn't shared such fine wine sooner, only for her to reveal it was a treasure she'd kept for centuries. It was a memento left by her late master, and she only parted with it because he promised her a fusion stage magical treasure. She pouted, complaining that he was too skinny and making her uncomfortable, so he told her to get down, and she hopped to the ground. Dropping her playful act, she looked at him with a sudden, serious expression, warning Mo Hung about what was to come next. She told him in no uncertain terms that regardless of who might ask or what they might say, he must never mention a single word about the crystal grass to anyone as they approached the entrance of the Nether Spirit Valley. We see Lan Yinran and the others looking disappointed at not finding the treasure, so Mo Hung handed the purple sorrow eggs to Daoist Me. She was thrilled and kept her word. After confirming the treasure had no soul imprint, Mo Hung tucked it into his storage ring. But a moment later, Daoist Me turned on him, coldly suggesting he do her one last favor by leaving his head behind. She needed it to report back to her master, and soon, Duya and experts from various major sects began to surround them. They all stared greedily at Mo Hung and his new treasure, but he simply took another drink, asking if they really intended to fight now. Daoist Me didn't answer, choosing instead to swallow the purple sorrow eggs as the sound of cracking bones echoed through the valley. Di Junwan snorted in disgust at the sight of someone using insects to gain power, calling it a foolish and desperate move. Mo Hung remained expressionless. Even though the eggs had pushed Daoist Me's speed to the point of leaving afterimages, it wasn't enough. With a single strike of his arrow, her arm shattered without resistance, and her entire body dissolved into a puff of smoke. Strength gained through external force is always an illusion, and an illusion can never defeat the real thing, as he stood there calmly. He challenged the rest of them to step forward if they still wanted the treasure, causing Du Ya's face to twitch before he forced a smile. The man led his group away without looking back, while Lan Yinran turned, tucked a stray hair behind her ear, and softly addressed Mo Hung. We see Lan Yinran explaining that they must also depart, as 3 months have passed since they entered the valley, and though they found no secret treasures, she considers it an honor to have met him, mentioning the date of the 7th of July before thanking him for his company and bidding him farewell. She gives him one last lingering look before leaving with the others. Mo Hung simply shrugs his shoulders and watches them disappear into the distance. Suddenly, Di Junwan slaps her knee as if remembering something important, telling Mo Hung to go on ahead while she stays behind for a moment. She gives a mischievous little laugh while pulling a large sack out of her storage ring, her intentions becoming quite clear. She looks at the spiritual herbs and demonic beasts of the Nether Spirit Valley with a greedy expression, and by nightfall, we return to Serenity Peak. Mo Hang's master, Lung Qianing, rushes out to meet him, her storage rings practically overflowing with treasures and her presence as commanding as ever. With her long hair still damp from a recent bath, she watches as Mo Hung lands smoothly and bows respectfully to greet his master. Lung Qianing nods slightly, her sleeves fluttering as she looks at him with a hint of genuine admiration, asking how his training expedition went. He reports that his harvest was quite good, presenting the inner cores of the Scorpion King and the clear water toad along with several rare herbs. While she barely glances at the beast cores, her eyes light up the moment her gaze falls upon a particular stalk of crystal grass. She steps forward quickly to grab the stem, identifying it not as ordinary grass, but as the legendary water spirit realm-breaking grass. Mo Hung is momentarily stunned, as the two plants look nearly identical and the realm-breaking variant is rarely mentioned even in ancient texts. This particular herb is considered a celestial-grade treasure, capable of stabilizing one's foundation and harnessing the very essence of water. It was a treasure among treasures, undoubtedly the very item the upper sect required. With a look of absolute gravity, Qianing turned to Mo Hung with a final warning. She tells him that from this day forward, he must never mention this discovery to anyone, before advising him to get some well-earned rest. He understands perfectly. Meanwhile, Lung Qianing is increasingly satisfied to see he has already reached the peak of the late void refinement stage. She muses that it won't be long before he truly breaks through to the fusion stage, and the next day, we find him heading down the mountain for wine. At the Zuixiang Pavilion in the small town of Qingshan, the shopkeeper greets him as an immortal and presents a special batch of wine for him to taste. He lifts the jar and drinks deeply. While the flavor doesn't quite match his master's private stock, it is certainly a fine brew for the mortal world. A sudden commotion breaks out at the entrance as guards try to drive away a beggar dressed in tattered blue and green rags, prompting Mo Hung to step in and offer to pay for the man's wine. He stands up, puts away the wine remaining on the table, and begins to walk out, only for the beggar to suddenly reach out and grab his wrist. The beggar thanks the immortal with a smile. Mo Hung simply places a gold ingot into the man's hat before turning to vanish into the crowd, leaving the tavern behind. A look of genuine appreciation crosses the beggar's face as he watches him go, before he finally turns and walks into the establishment. Meanwhile, we return to the gates of the Qingxian sect. There stands Dan Yangzi with his hands behind his back, noting that Mo Hung has gone down the mountain again, even if the rules state that core disciples are not strictly bound. Mo Hung calmly replies that he hasn't broken any rules, causing Dan Yangzi's mouth to twitch as he realizes the young man has already reached the peak of the late void refinement stage. Since he himself is only at the mid-stage, the widening gap is hard to swallow. Suppressing his jealousy, he mentions hearing about the expedition to the Nether Spirit Valley. He asks if Mo Hung would be willing to gift him the remains of the half-step fusion stage demonic beast they encountered there. Mo Hung explains that his master has already taken it, suggesting that if the sect leader wants it, he must ask her directly, a response that clearly displeases Dan Yangzi. Quickly shifting his focus to the fusion-grade magical treasure, he demands that Mo Hung hand it over instead. He reminds Mo Hung that he is a disciple of the Qingxian sect, claiming that if his cultivation hadn't vanished back then, things might have been different. He suggests that Mo Hung should have been his disciple all along, asking him to hand over the treasure out of respect for his position. Suddenly, Di Junwan arrives, smelling strongly of wine and dressed in those same blue and green rags we saw earlier, remarking that her junior brother is truly insatiable. She lets out a loud wine-induced hiccup and staggers toward Mo Hung, squinting as she asks why there are suddenly 3 of him standing there. She wonders aloud when he learned a cloning technique, while Dan Yangzi roars in anger, reminding her that as a sect elder, she shouldn't be seen in such a state. He scolds her for leaving the mountain to drink and for her lack of decorum, but Di Junwan simply pouts, completely unfazed by his lecture. She tells him that the fusion-grade treasure has already been given to her, so he should stop dreaming about it and go find somewhere else to cool off. Veins pop on Dan Yangzi's forehead. He has been the sect leader for centuries, yet he wonders if this sect belongs to his family or to Mo Hung's lineage. He feels as though everyone is conspiring to protect Mo Hung. At that moment, Mo Hung pulls the treasure from his storage ring, and Di Junwan immediately snatches it up. She hugs it tightly, overjoyed to finally have a fusion-grade treasure of her own, while Dan Yangzi flings his sleeves in a rage and storms away. She scoffs at the idea of him coveting her treasure, telling him to keep dreaming before turning to Mo Hung with a playful smile, calling him Little Mo. She asks if he visited the Zuixiang Tavern and wonders how he became so wealthy, considering Di Junwan is the master of Linjian Peak. 200 years ago, she stripped the mountain bare of its herbs, leaving nothing behind but a single, dilapidated thatched hut. Di Junwan wraps her arms around his neck and whispers, asking if he is planning to brew some wine. She suggests that she should accompany him, but Mo Hung hesitates, knowing her thirst for wine might lead to a slip of the tongue. However, he realizes that her peak fusion stage cultivation might actually help him suppress the potent effects of the water spirit breaking grass. To avoid being discovered, they agree on 3 conditions before he brings her back to Qingjing Peak that evening, where she sits cross-legged. She chants an incantation, creating a special spiritual barrier that blankets the area for 10 miles, sealing in every trace of spiritual energy. As Di Junwan maintains her meditative state, the barrier tightens its grip. Not even a whisper of spiritual power can escape its bounds. Not even a bird could fly out of there. Suddenly, the Rue beast scurries out of the room and leaps onto Mo Hung's shoulder, calling him a bad human. It complains about how long he was gone, claiming it's starving, even though Mo Hung had left it in the care of Shun Xueju, who is now in seclusion. The little creature grumbles that it finished all the snacks he left behind and hasn't eaten a single thing in half a month. He hands it a mid-grade spirit stone, which makes Di Junwan's heart ache, as she knows that could have been traded for plenty of fine wine. With a flick of his fingers, the water spirit breaking grass rises into the air, met by a burst of flame that makes Di Junwan's eyebrows arch in surprise. She recognizes the glazed true fire immediately, asking Little Mo where on earth he managed to obtain such a legendary flame. It is, after all, the most coveted flame for any alchemist. When he explains his master gave it to him, Di Junwan is green with envy. After about an hour, the herb melts completely into a single drop of spiritual liquid, which he carefully divides into dozens of smaller droplets. The moment the liquid touches the wine, a rich, mellow aroma erupts, as deep and intoxicating as the midnight sky. The fragrance is so thick and inviting that Di Junwan finds herself swallowing hard, her throat moving as she prepares for a taste. But to her dismay, he puts it all away, explaining that the wine needs 3 years to brew and promising to deliver it to her then. 3 more years. Di Junwan's face darkens at the news, and though she begs for just a single sip, Mo Hung firmly refuses her. He stands up to sense the shifting energy. We realize that if Di Junwan hadn't set up that barrier, this spiritual power would have flooded the entire sect by now. As the moon sinks behind the mountains, we find Di Junwan sprawled across the table, fast asleep. She has abandoned all sense of decorum, surrounded by dozens of empty wine jars scattered across the floor. It is a bit much, honestly. Mo Hung begins tidying up the mess, knowing that if his master saw this, she might just toss Di Junwan's stone scriptures right off the cliff. Meanwhile, the Rue beast hops onto Di Junwan's stomach, clearly planning to take a nap in those soft surroundings. We shift our gaze to the Xinxian sect, where Nailin Yanran is about to leave her courtyard when a man in white robes, with a dignified air blocks her path. Lu Liang, she says, I have told you many times already. There is absolutely no possibility between us. Without a backward glance, she walks away, leaving Lu Liang with a deeply furrowed brow. He watches her depart, his expression turning dark. As a powerful fusion stage expert who visits this sect every year, he feels insulted by her treatment. If not for the sake of her dynasty, he tells himself he wouldn't even look at her. Just then, Cui Ling, the princess's personal maid, steps out of the room. Brother Lu Liang, she asks, do you know why the princess has suddenly started ignoring you? Lu Liang stops in his tracks as Cui Ling follows Wang Teng's instructions. She recounts everything that has happened recently, specifically mentioning the events at the Huaishui Bamboo Pavilion. Lu Liang's face turns grim in an instant. After all, Nalin Yinran is his fiancée. The marriage contract was personally settled between the Xinjian sect and the dynasty. He never expected her to be out with a Qingxian disciple. Nalin Yinran, you will go through with this marriage whether you want to or not, he mutters. As for that brat from the Qingxian sect, I will personally take his head and give it to you as a gift. He then takes the fusion-grade treasure intended for the princess and hands it to Cui Ling instead. Her eyes light up and she flashes a strange, knowing smile. To be honest, she's quite the opportunist. Back at the Qingxian sect in southern Dongling, Imo Hung slowly opens his eyes and looks at the still snoring Di Junwan with a helpless sigh. Just then, the door is pushed open and Lung Qianing walks in, only to find Di Junwan in a state of complete disarray. Her brows furrow in anger as she commands Di Junwan to get up. Startled, Di Junwan snaps her eyes open and sits up abruptly. With her clothes still a mess, she doesn't even bother to tidy herself, simply scratching her head and asking what her senior sister wants. Lung Qianing is absolutely fuming, scolding her for being so indecent and lazy, especially while in the presence of a disciple. She asks what kind of example this sets, but Di Junwan simply snorts in disdain, asking her sister what on earth she is thinking. She claims she would never dream of robbing the cradle like that. Lung Qianing, however, has no interest in hearing any more excuses. With a wave of her hand, a burst of ice blue energy lifts Di Junwan and flings her toward the horizon like a falling star. Lung Qianing then turns to Mo Hung, her voice tinged with a bit of blame, noting that his martial aunt is far too addicted to wine. She looks at him sternly, clearly worried about the influence such behavior might have on a young man's reputation. She warns that if word gets out, he'll never find a cultivation partner. Mo Hung simply rubs his nose, noting he's only 19. He hasn't even thought about such things yet. Lung Qianing glances at him, sits on a prayer mat, and mentions that in 6 months, the sect will hold the Great Elder election. Any disciple at the Void Refinement stage or above can participate, and the winners will become sect elders. If one can secure the position of chief elder, they will eventually be in line to inherit the leadership. She reveals she has already signed him up. Mo Hung falls silent for a moment, knowing these elections only happen every 300 years. During this time, all the veteran experts who failed previously will emerge, including many powerful figures at the fusion stage. The Qingxian sect has a 1,000-year heritage, hiding many old monsters and sword seed elders who will surely seize this chance. While his talent is exceptional, he is only at the peak of late void refinement. Against a fusion cultivator, his odds aren't great. Unless, of course, he's in his drunken state. Lung Qianing pats his shoulder, telling him not to feel too much pressure yet. She promises that if he truly manages to become the chief elder, she will reward him handsomely. Mo Hang gives a small nod. Since it is his master's task, he must see it through no matter the obstacles, though he'll certainly need to prepare plenty of wine to avoid any unexpected accidents during their sparring. And after a few brief pleasantries, Mo Hung carries the sharp beast away from Qingjing Peak. He decides to head over to Xiaozhu Peak to check on Shen Xuezhu. It has been several months, and he wonders how she is faring. Deep in the bamboo forest of Xiaozhu Peak, we find Shen Xuezhu sitting on a rock. Hearing footsteps, she doesn't even bother to look up. She tells the visitor that she already asked not to be disturbed, but her attendant quickly clarifies that it is her martial uncle who has arrived. Shen Xuezhu stands up instantly and rushes out of the forest, her clever eyes brimming with a deep sense of longing the moment she sees him. Calling out to her martial uncle, she throws her arms open and lunges toward him. His first instinct is to dodge, but her aggrieved expression stops him. He stands his ground as she crashes into his embrace, crying out that he is finally back and that she feared the worst had happened. Her voice breaks with a sob, and he gently reaches out to rub her head, telling her to rest easy, which is a comfort she clearly needed. He assures her that her martial uncle isn't so easily killed by monsters. Shen Xuezhu purses her lips and looks at the soft armor on his chest. When he mentions he is wearing the armor, she notes that the piece she crafted was indeed a work of great skill, her small hand tidying her hair. She smiles, noting she couldn't have made it without the one-horn magic dragon scales he provided. Later, we find them by the moonlit Huaishui Lake. The moonlight reflects off the water like silk as a wooden boat rests by the shore. Mo Hung sits there, lazily shaking his wine gourd. Shen Xuezhu sits at the bow, her pale feet gently splashing in the lake as the reflection of the moon dances between her toes. After taking a few sips of wine, she asks if he plans to participate in the elder election happening in 6 months. He admits he hadn't planned on it, but his master insisted. It turns out Shen Xuezhu's own master has signed her up as well. However, she knows her cultivation is lacking and doubts she can become an elder. She looks at her own flushed face in the water's reflection. With a soft sigh, she promises she will at least be there to cheer him on, though she seems quite resigned to her own fate. Mo Hung tells her there is no need to jump to such conclusions. He stands up and pulls her with him to land steadily in the center of the lake. Her toes touch the surface, sending ripples across the water. He observes that as a fellow sword cultivator, her style is currently far too heavy. He decides to teach her a new technique today, standing on the surface of the lake as easily as if he were walking on solid ground. Closing his eyes, Mo Hung swings his sword, sending a ripple of sword energy across the lake as he begins a dance that seems impossibly light. Behind him, he leaves a trail of ink-like afterimages. Shen Xuezhu watches in a daze as the lush green scenery around her begins to shift. The world transforms into the ink-washed peaks of a traditional painting, where every movement is simple, fluid, and utterly free. He tilts his head back to take several deep gulps of strong wine, shouting that he is like a bird in the heavens, wandering across the 8 seas. Drinking to transcend the firmament, he styles himself a drunken immortal before unleashing a final, powerful strike. The sword's glow spreads like golden red wings, cutting through the mist as he asks Shiweju if she has managed to see the technique clearly. Shen Shiweju is too immersed in the beauty of the swordplay to answer. Suddenly, he points his blade toward the sky, and the flowers begin to fall. As the sword descends, a sharp, cold wind sweeps through, sending petals flying from both banks of the lake. As he landed lightly on the surface of the lake, he realized the Xiuxing sword dance was far too aggressive for his weakened body to sustain for long. This new dance is called the setting sun, a style that balances softness with strength, bridging the gap between the mundane and the divine. He hands her a sword manual he drew by hand. Shun Shuiju clutches it tightly to her chest, offering her martial uncle her deepest thanks. She hesitates, wondering aloud why his sword style seems so similar to the sect's official manuals, yet feels so fundamentally different. He explains that all martial arts share a single root, but the Qin family's methods have flaws. Before she can respond, he has already vanished. Left only with the lingering warmth of the manual in her arms, Shun Shuiju bites her lip and lowers her head in a fit of shyness. A stern voice suddenly echoes from behind her. It seems the master of Shaozhu Peak, Bai Yuling, has appeared out of nowhere. Shun Shuiju spins around instantly, hiding the manual behind her back as Bai Yuling approaches with a discerning look. Smelling the scent of alcohol, the elder frowns and asks if she's been drinking again. Shuiju quickly claims it was just a small cup. Bai Yuling starts to scold her, but stops herself, remembering Imo Heng's habit of drinking while he trains. To be honest, she knows his influence well. She asks if that incredible sword intent from a moment ago was caused by her martial uncle, noting that his insight into the blade is truly peerless. Bai Yuling fixes her gaze on the lake, where the sword's glow has yet to fade, and reaches out her hand to touch the lingering energy. To her surprise, a small cut appears on her fingertip. It seems the lingering sword intent is sharp enough to wound even her. Realizing the sheer power left behind, Bai Yuling leaps toward the distant green mountains, her expression darkening as she whispers softly. She speaks to the memory of her husband, hoping that if he truly has such strength, he will use it to protect their daughter. Elsewhere, a striking figure appears. Wang Teng asks curiously who she is, and Dan Yangzi calmly identifies her as Lu Lingjiao. She is a cultivator in the late void refining stage who, 300 years ago, competed alongside him for the position of sect master. Lu Lingjiao looks up at Deng Yangzi with a cold, mocking smile before approaching Leng Qianing and bowing respectfully to her senior sister. Leng Qianing notes that 300 years have passed, and Lingjiao has finally reached the great success stage, welcoming her back after their long separation. As Leng Qianing gently adjusts a stray lock of hair behind the woman's ear, Lu Lingjiao glances at Wang Teng, standing beside Dan Yangzi. Seeing only greed and vulgarity in his eyes, she turns away in disgust, prompting a cold snort from Dan Yangzi as he addresses his junior sister. He asks if she intends to ignore her senior brother entirely, but Lu Lingjiao simply sneers, calling him by his name without any title. She reminds him that he only took his current seat through trickery and opportunism. To be honest, she hasn't forgotten a thing. She mocks him for still being stuck in the early void refining stage after all these years, leaving Dan Yangzi utterly speechless and humiliated. Intimidated by her sharp gaze, he sinks back into his seat and officially begins the proceedings, announcing the rules for the 22 participants. Opponents will be decided by drawing lots to select the 10 great elders, followed by the chief elder. And so, the first battle begins. It is Lu Lingjiao against the Swordseed elder, Zhou Fong, who immediately summons her immortal blade to face the challenger. Zhou Fong charges forward with her sword, but Lu Lingjiao vanishes instantly, reappearing directly behind her opponent. With a blade pressed to her throat, Zhou Fong is defeated in a single breath. The second battle features the former prodigy, Zhou Tsang. A bolt of heavenly lightning as thick as a barrel crashes down, charring the opponent's hair to ash and leaving them unconscious on the ground. In the third and fourth battles, the Swordseed elders suffer consecutive, crushing defeats, especially against the former prodigy Qi Han and his demon Lotus. With a single strike, he shatters his opponent's bones, leaving the Swordseed elders without a single victory to their names so far. In the fifth battle, Wang Teng takes the stage against an opponent only at the peak of the nascent soul stage, securing a crushing victory almost instantly as the crowd cheers. When Di Junwan hears the outer disciples shouting the title of Great Emperor, she can't help but cover her mouth and laugh, while Wang Teng's face turns a shade of iron blue. Ever since being hunted in the Nether Spirit Valley, those are the last words he wants to hear, and to be honest, it is a rather amusing sight. Shun Shuju leans in to ask why, and after hearing the story whispered in her ear, she bursts into laughter just as it becomes our protagonist's turn to enter the fray. His opponent is Fan Tao, a prodigy from the previous generation who looks sickly as he holds a soul-attracting banner. His ultimate technique is known as the Crying Funeral. He uses his wails to draw out an opponent's soul, greeting his junior brother with a warning that he is about to start crying, while Di Junwan waves from the stands. She shouts for him to give the man a thorough beating, noting she hasn't liked his face for centuries, which causes Fan Tao's expression to crumble even further. He complains that her grudge is hundreds of years old, but as the battle begins, Fan Tao drops to his knees and begins to wail in a loud, mournful display. His cries are incredibly piercing, so much so that the disciples on the sidelines find themselves overcome with a sudden, shared sense of deep sorrow. Purple-black spirits begin to drift over the stage, and among them, we see the soul of Lu Ruyan, causing our hero to frown as he watches her ghost appear. He addresses the memory of Junior's sister Lu Ruyan, noting that since Deng Yangzi was the one who killed her, he will now be the one to guide her soul to the afterlife. With a flick of his finger, his sword rises, and countless peach blossoms and fallen leaves from across the sect begin to lift slowly into the air, swirling in a pink vortex. The petals transform into a multitude of immortal swords, stripping the mountain of its blossoms in an instant to block the onslaught of the restless spirits. He takes a deep drink from his wine gourd as the peach blossom swordlight flares. In his hands, the falling leaves of spring and the autumn winds all become his blade. Even deadwood becomes a weapon, for in the sword path of heaven and earth, there is nothing that cannot serve as a blade, and he points his finger toward the sky once more. The sword light is blindingly bright, not only shattering the lingering spirits, but also sending Fan Tao flying over 100 meters away from the stage. Lung Qining watches the entire display with narrowed eyes, remaining silent. Deep down, she knows that he will eventually have to leave the Qingxian sect behind. The matches that follow are less intense, consisting mostly of standard duels between cultivators at the nascent soul and spirit severing stages. Shun Xuezhu had assumed she stood no chance of becoming an elder, yet she surprisingly manages to defeat a cultivator at the peak of the nascent soul stage. She stuns everyone with her graceful sword dance, and after her victory, she jumps for joy and runs straight toward him to share her excitement. "Uncle, I'm finally a sect elder," she exclaims, and as he reaches out to pat her head, Shun Xuezhu's face turns a bright, lovely shade of crimson. She shyly asks if he has time that evening, mentioning she has prepared some excellent wine and wishes to share a quiet moment of tea and conversation. At the mention of good wine, our hero finds himself unable to refuse, and the two agree to meet later at the bamboo pavilion by the Huai River. Wang Tung watches his retreating back with eyes full of jealousy, muttering that once the young sect master of the Divine Sword sect arrives, Lin Maheng is finished. In his mind, he is certain that even Maheng's master won't be able to protect him when that moment finally comes. He muses to himself about how strange humans are for enjoying such things, before playfully flicking the forehead of the spirit beast accompanying him. We see him lead Shun Xuezhu to the second floor of a tavern, taking a seat by the window just as the dancers begin to play the harp. The music flows as smooth as silk, but just as they are about to order their wine, the peaceful atmosphere is suddenly interrupted. A figure in white appears slowly at the top of the stairs, a man dressed in long robes, carrying himself with an air of immense authority. With an elegant stride, he walks straight to their table and asks if he might sit, though he doesn't actually wait for an answer. He drops into a seat immediately, causing the spirit beast to leap into Maheng's arms, baring its teeth and staring warily at the newcomer. Maheng sets down his cup and looks up to find a cultivator at the body integration stage. The man in white simply glances at the wine on the table. The stranger remarks on how free-spirited Maheng seems, noting that it's rare for someone of his cultivation level to still enjoy common plum wine. Our hero remains calm, sensing from the fluctuations of spiritual energy that the man is only at the early stage of body integration. The man announces he has come for a favor, and as Maheng narrows his eyes, he begins to slowly circulate the spiritual energy within his body. "I want your head on a platter," the man in white says, his tone turning ice-cold in an instant. He introduces himself as Lu Liang, the young sect master of the Divine Sword sect from Xinyo Hezhou, claiming he has come to seek justice. The sound of wine cups hitting the floor echoes through the room as the crowd gasps, yet Maheng doesn't flinch, speaking only in a soft voice. He tells Xuezhu to take the spirit beast and return to the sect first. Lu Liang simply sneers, unimpressed by the reputation of the Qingxian sect. To him, the sect is a bottom-tier power compared to those in his homeland, and with a worried look, Shun Xuezhu leaves the tavern as instructed. As Xuezhu flies toward the sect on her sword, Maheng drains the wine jar before him and flicks a burst of spiritual energy toward Lu Liang. The energy vanishes the moment Lu Liang moves his finger, and Maheng disappears with it, choosing not to return to the sect, but to a distant location. We see them reappear among mountains thousands of miles away, where Lu Liang stands atop a peak with cold, mocking eyes. He sneers that by not fleeing to his sect, Maheng has chosen this place as his grave, though our hero wonders aloud whose grave it will truly be. Lu Liang loses his patience, declaring that Maheng's greatest mistake was ever having a connection with Nalan Yanran. He claims that in 10 years, during their grand dual cultivation ceremony, he will have a very specific gift prepared for his bride. He intends to present her with Maheng's head. Ignoring this delusional talk, Maheng simply takes out the plum wine his master gave him. Lu Liang conjures a crimson gold staff in his palm and points it at our hero, telling the young brat to prepare for death. Maheng finishes the strong wine and wipes his mouth, noting how strange it is for the young sect master of the Divine Sword sect to use a staff instead of a sword. Lu Liang boasts that his technique was taught by a grand master, a power capable of shattering a nest of 10,000 demons with a single strike. Realizing this is a technique from the ally kingdom in Dongxing Shenzhou, Ma Hing finally begins to take the situation seriously. A technique that makes such a genius so arrogant is surely no ordinary feat, so Ma Hing raises a finger toward the sky to summon his sword intent. The energy manifests into dozens of swords, each glowing with a different color as they begin to rotate at a high speed. Lu Liang laughs at the display, mocking the idea of a mere void refinement cultivator daring to challenge a body integration powerhouse. He swings the crimson gold staff with a roar, its shadow tearing through the sky toward Ma Hing, who takes one last sip of wine. His gaze turns sharp as the sword light and staff shadow collide in midair, the force causing the surrounding mountains to tremble. Under the massive shockwave, the peaks for miles begin to crumble into dust, and through the rising mist, Ma Hing's voice echoes calmly. He recites a verse as the wind rises, causing Lu Liang's pupils to contract as the mist clears to reveal the shattered landscape. Ma Hing stands alone with his sword, the old gourd swaying gently at his waist, and we realize the true battle has only just begun.